The night Emily Thorne disappeared was unnaturally still. No wind rustled through the trees of Blackwood Forest. No animals called out in the darkness. Even the usual symphony of insects had fallen silent, as if the whole world was holding its breath. The search party found only one clue: her flashlight, still glowing faintly at the edge of Widow's Pond, pointing toward the dark water like an accusation. The beam illuminated something floating on the surface, a single red shoe, slowly circling in the stagnant water. That was 3 years ago. They never found her body. I know this because I've studied every detail of the case. I've read every newspaper article, every police report, every witness statement. I've walked the same dark path she took that night, stood at the edge of the same pond, and felt the same inexplicable dread crawling up my spine. Because Emily Thorne wasn't the first to disappear in Blackwood, and I knew with a certainty that kept me awake at night that she wouldn't be the last. My name is Dr. Abigail Foster, and I specialize in investigating phenomena that others dismiss as superstition or coincidence. Most people in my field call themselves paranormal investigator. I prefer the term phenomenologist. It sounds more scientific, more respectable. It helps people take me seriously when I ask them about the voices they hear in empty rooms, or the shadows they see moving against the laws of life. I came to the town of Blackwood because of a pattern: 17 disappearances over 120 years, all with striking similarities, all occurring during the same lunar phase, all leaving behind a single personal item at the edge of Widow's Pond, all unsolved. What I didn't realize when I arrived was that I wasn't investigating their story. I was becoming part of it. And now, as I sit in this rented cabin with the doors locked and windows barred, listening to something scratching at the walls and whispering my name in a voice that sounds horrifyingly familiar, I'm writing this account as both a warning and a confession. If you're reading this, then either I've survived to publish my findings, or someone has found this manuscript after I've become disappearance number 18. Either way, the truth about Blackwood will finally be told. I only hope you'll believe me, because it's coming again. I can hear it outside, moving around the cabin, testing for weaknesses, calling to me in the voices of those it's taken before. And tonight is the night of the dark moon, when the cycle begins anew. Chapter 1: Arrival. The town of Blackwood appeared suddenly as I crested the hill, nestled in a valley that seemed to cradle it like a hand holding something fragile. From this distance it looked almost idyllic, a small collection of buildings, with a church spire rising from the center, surrounded by dense forest that gave the town its name. It was like a scene from a postcard, the kind that promises small-town charm and simple life. Only when you looked closer did you notice the details that disrupted the perfect picture: the peeling paint on many of the buildings, the empty storefronts on Main Street, the unnatural stillness that seemed to hover over everything like a shroud. I'd driven nearly 6 hours from the university where I taught occasionally, following increasingly narrow and poorly maintained roads. My GPS had lost signal about 40 minutes earlier, forcing me to navigate by the directions I'd written down as a precaution. Old habits from field research always have a backup plan when technology fails. The rental car bumped and protested as I made my way down into the valley. I'd requested an SUV, anticipating rough terrain, but the agency had given me a sedan with suspensions that complained loudly about every pothole. Another reminder that this trip was self-funded, with all the limitations that implied. The university had rejected my request for a research grant, citing insufficient scientific basis and questionable methodology. The same response I'd received many times before. Academic institutions rarely approve studies focused on local legends, disappearances and what my department head dismissively called ghost story. They preferred their psychology research to involve control groups and double-blind trials, not interviews with traumatized locals and late-night vigils in supposedly haunted locations. I understood their position. I even respected, but they were missing something crucial about human experience. The patterns that emerged when you looked at collective trauma through the lens of folklore, the way communities processed inexplicable events by creating narratives that might contain, hidden within their supernatural elements, kernels of truth. The sign welcoming me to Blackwood was weathered. The paint faded to the point where the population number was illegible. That was fitting. According to my research, the population fluctuated significantly with each generation. People had a habit of leaving Blackwood and not coming back. My first destination was the Lakeside Inn, a 2-story building that sat at the edge of town, overlooking the smaller of Blackwood's 2 bodies of water, Miller's Lake, Widow's Pond. The location that featured in so many of the disappearances was deeper in the forest, away from casual visitors. I'd visit it tomorrow, in daylight, after I'd settled in and made my initial contacts in town. The inn's parking lot contained only 3 other vehicles: a pickup truck with local plates, a delivery van, and a car with rental tags like my own. Tourism wasn't exactly booming in Blackwood. As I stepped out of my car, the air hit me with an unexpected chill that penetrated my light jacket. According to my research, the average temperature in Blackwood was several degrees cooler than surrounding areas, even those at similar elevations. One of many anomalies I hoped to understand. The inn's front desk was manned by an elderly woman with steel gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her name tag identified her as Margaret. She looked up from her crossword puzzle as I entered, her expression neither welcoming nor hostile, just carefully neutral. "A set reservation for Foster," I said, placing my ID and credit card on the counter. She studied my ID longer than necessary before typing something into an ancient computer. "Dr. Abigail Foster," she read aloud, "from Grayson University. What brings you to our little town, Doc? We don't get many academics here." This was the first test. In my experience, how I explained my presence would determine how much cooperation I received. In some communities, being direct about my interest in local legends and unexplained events opened doors. In others, it slammed them shut. I'd researched Blackwood thoroughly before arriving. This was a town with a complex relationship to its dark history, simultaneously defined by it and attempting to escape it. The disappearances were both a taboo subject and an inescapable undercurrent in local consciousness. "I'm researching the historical patterns of rural population decline in New England communities," I said, opting for a partial truth. "Blackwood has some interesting demographic shifts over the past century that fit my study parameters." Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly. She didn't believe me, not entirely, but she also couldn't dispute the academic-sounding explanation. "Room 7, 2nd floor. End of the hall," she said, handing me an actual metal key rather than a key card. "Breakfast is served from 6 to 9, dinner from 5 to... There's a binder in your room with local information. Checkout is at 11. She recited this without enthusiasm, then returned to her crossword puzzle. Our interaction clearly concluded. Room 7 was clean but dated, with flowered wallpaper that might have been charming when first installed decades ago. The furniture was solid wood, built in an era when things were made to last. A large window overlooked the lake, which was now reflecting the late afternoon sun. It would have been a peaceful view if not for the unnaturally dark shadow of Blackwood Forest, looming on the far shore. I unpacked methodically, arranging my research materials on the small desk, my laptop, digital recorder, notebooks, and the thick file containing everything I'd compiled about Blackwood's disappearances. 17 cases spanning more than a century, starting with the disappearance of Elizabeth Blackwood herself in 1902, the widow for whom the pond was named. Each case followed the same pattern. A person would go missing during the dark moon phase. A search would find a personal item, a shoe, a hat, a watch at the edge of Widow's Pond. No bodies were ever recovered. The disappearances occurred in clusters, with gaps of 8 to 12 years between them. If the pattern held true, Blackwood was due for another cluster. Emily Thorne's disappearance 3 years ago could have been the first in the current cycle. That meant there was a chance I could do more than just document past events. I might witness the phenomenon firsthand. The thought sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the room's inadequate heating. I needed to establish contact with key informants as quickly as possible. Based on my preliminary research, there were several people in town who might be willing to talk to me. Sheriff Thomas Burke, who had led the search for Emily Thorne and had lived in Blackwood his entire life. Alice Mercer, the town librarian, who maintained the historical archives and was rumored to have her own theories about the disappearance. Joseph Thorne, Emily's grandfather, who had become something of a local eccentric after her disappearance, claiming that she still spoke to him from the forest. Dr. Helen Richards, the local physician, who had treated several of the search party members for what they described as exposure after the most recent disappearance. There was also the matter of the other current hotel guest, the one with the rental car. Another researcher, perhaps, or just a lost tourist. Either way, it might be worth investigating. I checked my watch. Just past 5 p.m. Still time for dinner at the inn's restaurant, where I might be able to start gathering information casually. People tend to be more forthcoming in social settings, especially when they don't realize they're being interviewed. The restaurant was nearly empty, just an older couple in one corner, and a middle-aged man sitting alone at a table by the window. Based on his laptop and the papers spread around him, I guessed he might be the owner of the other rental car. There was something vaguely familiar about him, but I couldn't place it. I chose a table that would allow me to observe both him and the elderly couple without being too obvious. The waitress, a young woman whose name tag read Lucy, brought me a menu and a glass of water. Just passing through, she asked with practiced cheerfulness that didn't quite reach her eyes. Actually, I'll be staying for a few weeks, I replied. I'm doing research on the area. Lucy's smile faltered for just a moment. Research on Blackwood. Historical demographics, I said, using the same cover story I'd given Margaret. Rural population trends. Oh, her relief was almost palpable. Well, there's not much to do around here, honestly, but the hiking is good, if you're into that. Just to the marked trails. Easy to get lost in Blackwood Forest if you don't know your way around. I nodded gratefully. Any recommendations for the best trails? Miller's Ridge is nice. Good views of the town. There's a trail map in that binder in your room. She hesitated, then added in a lower voice, but I'd stay away from the trails near Widow's Pond. They're not well maintained, and the area gets really foggy, even in good weather. I nodded again, trying to keep my expression neutral despite the mention of the exact location I was most interested in. I'll keep that in mind. What do you recommend from the menu? As Lucy described the pot roast special, I noticed the man by the window looking in my direction. When our eyes met, he quickly returned to his laptop, but I had the distinct impression he'd been listening to our conversation. After Lucy left with my order, I pretended to check my phone while observing him more carefully. He was approximately mid-40s, with streaks of gray in his dark hair. His clothes were casual but well-made. Jeans, a button-down shirt, and a jacket that looked suitable for outdoor work. The papers on his table appeared to include maps. Another researcher was the most likely explanation. The question was, what was he researching, and was it connected to my own interests? I decided on a direct approach. Picking up my water glass, I walked over to his table. Excuse me, I said. I couldn't help noticing you're working with maps of the area. I'm doing research here as well, and I was wondering if you might have some insights to share. He looked up surprised, then gestured to the empty chair across from him. Please join me. I could use a break anyway. He extended his hand. Daniel Wright. The name clicked immediately. From New England Historical Society. I read your paper on folklores, historical documentation in isolated communities. He smiled, pleased to be recognized. And you're Dr. Abigail Foster. I attended your talk on collective trauma manifestations at the Paranormal Psychology Conference in Boston last year. I sat down, both gratified and slightly unnerved.
My work wasn't widely known outside a very specific academic niche. What brings you to Blackwood, Mr. I asked, though I was beginning to suspect the answer. The same thing that brings you here, I imagine. He lowered his voice. The disappearances, the pattern, the dark moon cycle that's about to begin again. I shouldn't have been surprised. Anyone who had done serious research into unexplained disappearances in New England would eventually find their way to Blackwood. The pattern was too distinct, too compelling to ignore. How long have you been here? I asked. 3 days. Long enough to confirm that nobody wants to talk about it, especially not to outsiders. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. I've tried approaching it from different angles. Historical research, local legends, even pretending to be writing a hiking guide to get information about Widow's Pond. Nothing works. It's like the whole town has taken a vow of silence. That's not uncommon in communities with traumatic histories, I said, especially when those histories lack resolution. No bodies, no answers, just absence and uncertainty. It creates a kind of collective wound that people protect by avoiding it altogether. Daniel nodded. The interesting thing is that it's not just reluctance I'm encountering. It's fear, real fear. These people aren't just uncomfortable with the subject, they're terrified, and not of the disappearances themselves, but of something specific in those words. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the restaurant's air conditioning. Have you been to Widow's Pond yet? Yesterday. He struggled to find the words. There's something wrong with that place. Objectively, scientifically wrong. Sound doesn't travel normal. Compasses malfunction. And there's a feeling there. A weight that's hard to describe. Infrasound, maybe, I suggested. Many reportedly haunted locations have been found to have environmental factors that create frequencies below human hearing threshold. They can cause feelings of dread, discomfort, even hallucinations. Maybe, Daniel said, though he didn't sound convinced. But that doesn't explain everything I experienced there, or the pattern of the disappearances, or why everyone in this town is so afraid to even discuss Widow's Pond, that they've created an unspoken agreement to warn people away without ever explaining why. Our conversation was interrupted by Lucy bringing my dinner to Daniel's table without comment, as if finding me there was expected. I wondered how often the inn had multiple researchers as guests, drawn by the same mystery. As I ate, Daniel and I compared notes. His research approach was more historical than psychological, focusing on the town's founding and the original Blackwood family. He had spent most of his time in the town archives, while I was planning to interview residents with connections to the more recent disappearances. We should coordinate, he suggested, share information. 2 perspectives might reveal patterns that one would miss. I agree. Having a colleague in this investigation was unexpected but potentially valuable, and there was something about Daniel that inspired trust, a serious dedication to understanding rather than sensationalizing. We agreed to meet the following morning to visit Widow's Pond together. There was safety in numbers, and 4 eyes would observe more than 2. After dinner I returned to my room to review my notes and prepare for tomorrow's expedition. Through the open window, I could hear the gentle lapping of Miller's Lake against the shore, and the distant sounds of the forest. Normal, natural sounds that should have been soothing. But as I sat at the desk, organizing my recorder and camera for the next day, the sounds from the forest changed. The rhythmic calling of nightbirds stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so complete it felt like pressure against my eardrum, then carried on a wind that seemed to come from nowhere. I heard it, a soft melodic humming, a woman's voice, though too distant to make out any specific tune. It rose and fell, hypnotic and somehow familiar, though I knew I'd never heard it before. We moved to the window, straining to identify the source. The forest on the far side of the lake was just a black mass in the darkness, but I had the unsettling feeling that something within that darkness was looking back at me. The humming stopped. The nightbirds resumed their calls as if nothing had interrupted them. I closed and locked the window, telling myself it was just to block the night. But as I prepared for bed, I found myself checking the lock twice more, driven by an instinct I couldn't explain and didn't want to examine too closely. Sleep came reluctantly, and when it did, I dreamed of dark water and pale hands reaching up from the depths. And throughout the dream that same humming, now accompanied by words I could almost but not quite understand. A song about returning, about coming home to the dark, I woke at 3:17 a.m., gasping, the remnants of the dream clinging to me like cobweb. And though my room was silent, I could have sworn I still heard that humming, fading like an echo in my mind. It took me a long time to fall back asleep, and when I did, I dreamed of a red shoe floating in black water, slowly circling, waiting for its owner to return. Chapter 2. Widow's Pond. Morning arrived with a heavy mist that clung to the surface of Miller's Lake, transforming the view from my window into something from a Gothic novel. The sun was trying to break through, creating an eerie, diffused light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I checked my phone. No service. Not surprising in such a remote location. My alarm had gone off as scheduled, but any messages or emails would have to wait until I found a signal. It warned my department secretary that I might be unreachable for periods during this research trip, but old habits had me checking anyway. As I dressed for the day, selecting practical hiking boots and layers that could be adjusted for changing weather, I tried to analyze my reaction to last night's experience. The humming from the forest, the abrupt silence of the night birds, had they been objectively unusual phenomena, or had my expectations colored my perception? Researchers call it priming. When your mind is prepared to notice certain patterns, you become hyper-aware of anything that might fit those patterns. I'd come to Blackwood looking for strangeness. It would be methodologically unsound to interpret every odd occurrence as evidence supporting my hypothesis, yet the dream had felt significant in ways I couldn't articulate. The specificity of it, that red shoe circling in black water, matched details from Emily Thorne's disappearance that weren't widely publicized. I'd read them in the police reports I'd obtained through a contact in the county records office, but they hadn't appeared in news coverage. Just coincidence, or something more? I pushed the questions aside as I headed downstairs. The small dining room was nearly empty. Just Daniel at a table by the window and an elderly man I hadn't seen before sitting at the counter. Daniel looked up as I entered, gesturing to a cup of coffee he'd apparently ordered for me. "Sleep well?" he asked, as I sat down. "Not particularly." He took a grateful sip of the coffee. "Strange dreams?" He nodded, unsurprised. "I haven't had a full night's sleep since I arrived. Something about this place." He trailed off, looking out at the mist-covered lake. "Did you hear it last night? The humming?" A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. "From the direction of the forest, around midnight." "Yes, exactly." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "I asked Lucy about it this morning. She claimed not to know what I was talking about, but her hands were shaking when she poured my coffee." Before I could respond, the elderly man at the counter turned toward us. He was thin to the point of gauntness, with deep-set eyes that seemed too large for his weathered face. His clothes, a flannel shirt and worn overalls, hung on his frame as if they'd been made for someone else. "You're here about the pond," he said. Not a question, a statement of fact, delivered in a voice that crackled like old paper. I exchanged a glance with Daniel before responding. "We're researchers," I said carefully, "interested in local history." The old man made a sound that might have been a laugh or a cough. "Nobody comes to Blackwood for history unless they're looking for the missing, and nobody looks for the missing unless they want to join them." He slid off his stool and approached our table. Up close, I could see that his eyes were an unusual pale blue, almost colorless. "Joseph Thorne," he said, extending a gnarled hand. Emily Thorne's grandfather, the man who claimed his missing granddaughter, still spoke to him from the forest. I shook his hand, feeling bones like twigs beneath paper-thin skin. "Dr. Abigail Foster, this is Daniel Robb." Joseph Thorne studied us both, with those unsettling pale eyes. "You won't find what you're looking for at the pond, or maybe you will, and that's worse." "Mr. Thorne," I said, trying to keep my voice gentle, "I've read about your granddaughter. I'm very sorry for your loss." His expression shifted, something flashing behind those pale eyes, grief or anger or perhaps both. "Emily isn't lost. She's waiting." "There's a difference." "Waiting for what?" Daniel asked. Joseph looked at him as if he'd asked why the sky was blue. "For the rest of course, for the pattern to complete, for the door to open." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "She tells me things, you know, when the moon is dark and the barrier is thin. She tells me what it's like on the other side." I resisted the urge to reach for my record. This was exactly the kind of first-hand account I'd come hoping to document, but startling Joseph might break the moment. "What does she tell you?" I asked, Instead, keeping my tone conversational, Joseph straightened up, suddenly guarded. You think I'm crazy? The grieving old man who can't accept his granddaughter is dead. He shook his head. But you'll see, when you go to the pond, you'll feel it. And if you're there when the dark moon rises, you'll hear them too, all of them. Not just Emily, calling. Beckoning. He turned to leave, then paused, looking back over his shoulder. If you go today, stay on the main path. The mist gets thick this time of year, easy to lose your way. And if you hear humming, don't follow it, no matter how beautiful it sounds. With that cryptic warning, he shuffled out of the dining room, leaving Daniel and me in silence. Well, Daniel said finally, that was informative. I finished for him, and consistent with documented phenomena associated with auditory hallucinations of deceased loved ones are fairly common, especially in cases where there's no body to provide closure. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Is that your professional assessment? Just grief-induced hallucinations? I sighed. It's the conventional explanation. But no, I don't think it's that simple. Not with the pattern of disappearances here. Not with the specific lunar correlation. Not with the recurring elements in the reports across more than a century. I pulled out my tablet and opened the file containing my research. Look at that, 17 disappearances, all during the dark moon phase, all with personal items found at Widow's Pond, all occurring in clusters, every 8 to 12 years. I showed him a timeline I'd created, marking each disappearance with a red dot. The clustering was unmistakable. Groups of 3 to 5 disappearances, then years of nothing, then another cluster. If the pattern holds, I continued, we're due for more disappearances soon. Emily Thorne 3 years ago could have been the first in the current cycle. Daniel studied the timeline, his expression grave. And if Joseph Thorne is right about something waiting for the pattern to complete, then we need to understand what's happening before anyone else goes missing. We finished our breakfast quickly after that, eager to get to Widow's Pond while we still had most of the day's light ahead of us. As we prepared to leave, Lucy approached our table with a brown paper bag, packed lunches. She explained, not meeting our eye. Margaret thought you might need them if you're exploring to...
I thanked her, noticing her nervous glance toward the windows. The mist was still heavy, though the sun was stronger now, burning through in patches to create dappled light on the lake's surface. Is there anything we should know about the trails around Widow's Pond? I asked, attempting one more time to elicit local knowledge. Lucy hesitated, conflict evident on her face. Finally, she said, just stay on the marked path and be back before dark. The forest is different at night. It wasn't much, but it confirmed the general unease that seemed to permeate every mention of the forest or the pond. No one would say exactly what they feared, just that there was something to fear. We took Daniel's rental car, which was better suited to the rough roads than my sedan. The drive to the forest's edge took about 20 minutes, following a winding road that deteriorated from asphalt to gravel to packed dirt. The forest grew denser as we approached, the trees taller and closer together, until they formed a canopy that filtered the sunlight into thin, shifting beams. The trailhead was marked by a weathered wooden sign that simply read, Blackwood Forest Trails. A smaller sign below it showed a crude map with colored lines representing different paths. One of those lines led to a small blue circle labeled Widow's Pond. No warning signs, no indication of danger, just that simple blue circle, as if it were any ordinary body of water. We parked in a small clearing that served as a makeshift lot, though ours was the only vehicle there. The air seemed cooler here than in town, with a dampness that suggested the mist had been even thicker among the trees. I shouldered my backpack, which contained water, the packed lunch, my digital recorder, a camera, and a few basic scientific instruments, a thermometer, a compass, and an EMF meter. Not because I expected to find ghosts, but because unexplained electromagnetic fluctuations could contribute to the feelings of dread people reported around supposedly haunted locations. Daniel's pack looked similar to mine, though I noticed he also carried what appeared to be surveying equipment for mapping anomalies. He explained when he caught me looking, if there are areas where compasses fail, where GPS readings go haywire, I want to document exactly where and how extensively. The trail started out wide and well maintained, with wooden markers every 100 yards or so. The forest around us was beautiful in a primal, untamed way. Ancient trees, covered in moss, dense undergrowth that looked like it had never felt human footsteps, and a profound silence broken only by occasional bird calls. As we walked, I activated my digital recorder. Blackwood Forest, approach to Widow's Pond, Day 1. I narrated. Time 10:17 a.m. Weather conditions, misty, approximately 52 degrees Fahrenheit. Ambient sounds limited primarily to our footsteps and sporadic bird activity. The trail gradually narrowed as we progressed deeper into the forest. The markers became less frequent and more weathered, some so faded they were barely visible. After about a mile, the main trail split, with the more traveled path continuing straight, while a narrower, overgrown path branched to the left. A small wooden arrow pointed down the left path, the word pond barely legible on its surface. Not exactly encouraging exploration, are they? Daniel commented as we turned onto the narrower path. The difference was immediate and striking. While the main trail had been relatively bright, with sunlight filtering through the canopy, this smaller path seemed to exist in perpetual twilight. The trees grew closer together, their branches intertwining overhead to block most of the light. The air felt colder too, dropping at least 10 degrees in the space of a few yards. Temperature decrease, noted. I said into my recorder, approximately 10 degrees Fahrenheit, within first 20 yards of pond trail. No obvious environmental factors to account for the change. Daniel pulled out his compass, frowning as the needle spun erratically. Compass malfunction beginning about 30 feet down the pond trail, he noted for his own records. We continued forward, the path growing increasingly difficult to follow. In some places, it nearly disappeared altogether, forcing us to guess at the correct direction. The mist, which had been burning off elsewhere, seemed thicker here, drifting between the trees in slow, curling tendrils that sometimes appeared to move against the gentle breeze. After another half-mile of increasingly difficult hiking, the trees began to thin slightly, and I caught glimpses of water ahead, black and still, reflecting nothing. Widow's Pond. As we emerged from the densest part of the forest into a small clearing at the pond's edge, I felt it, the sensation Daniel had tried to describe, a heaviness in the air, a pressure that was almost physical. My ears popped as if I'd changed altitude dramatically, though the pond was only slightly lower than the surrounding forest. The pond itself was smaller than I'd expected, perhaps 100 feet across at its widest point, roughly circular in shape. The water was unnaturally dark and completely still, its surface like black glass. No ripples, no movement, despite the light breeze that stirred the trees around us. No visible plant life grew along its edges, creating a barren ring of earth between the water and the forest proper. "It wrong," Daniel whispered beside me, and I knew exactly what he meant. There was something fundamentally unnatural about this place, something that registered at an instinctive level beyond rational analysis. I checked my instrument. The temperature had dropped another 5 degrees at the pond's edge. The EMF meter was giving erratic readings, spiking and then falling to 0 with no discernible pattern. My compass, like Daniel's, was useless, the needle spinning free. Instrumental anomalies,
consistent with reports. I noted into my recorder, my voice sounding flat and too loud in the unnatural quiet. Visual inspection shows no obvious source of electromagnetic interference, no power lines, no underground cables, no significant mineral deposits visible. Daniel had moved to the pond's edge, crouching to examine the water without touching it. No insects, he observed. No life of any kind that I can see. No algae, no fish, no water plants. Just nothing. He was right. The ecological dead zone around the pond was perhaps the most objectively disturbing thing about it. Every body of water, no matter how small, should host some form of life. The complete absence of it here defied natural. I joined him at the water's edge, careful to maintain my balance on the sloping bank. The water was so dark that it was impossible to gauge its depth, even right at the edge where it should have been shallow. According to local records, the pond has never been successfully sounded, I said, recalling my research. Every attempt to measure its depth has failed. Equipment malfunctions, cables break. The last scientific survey in 1987 ended when their sonar equipment inexplicably shut down and couldn't be restarted. Daniel nodded slowly. I read about that. The team also reported hearing voices while they worked, whispers that seemed to come from the water itself. I activated the EMF meter again, holding it closer to the water's surface. The needle jumped wildly before settling at its highest reading, vibrating slightly as if fighting against some force. Significant electromagnetic anomaly directly above the water. I record consistent readings at maximum scale of standard EMF detector. As I spoke, I noticed something, a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The heaviness in the air increased, pressing against my eardrums until the mist, which had been drifting aimlessly, began to move with purpose, curling toward us from across the pond's surface. And then we heard it, the humming, the same melodic sound I'd heard from across Miller's Lake the night before, but closer now, much closer. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, as if the air itself were vibrating with the sound. Daniel's head snapped up, his eyes wide. Do you hear that? I nodded, already reaching for my recorder to capture the sound. But as soon as I pressed the record button, the humming stopped, leaving a silence so profound it seemed to have physical weight. For several long moments, we stood frozen, waiting. The mist continued its slow approach, gliding across the black water, like a living thing. As it reached the shore near our feet, it began to rise, forming shapes that almost but not quite resembled human figures. My heart was pounding now, every instinct screaming danger, yet I couldn't look away from those shifting, ephemeral forms that seemed to reach toward us with tendrils of fog. The sound that broke the spell wasn't the humming resuming, but something more ordinary, the snap of a twig in the forest behind us, followed by a human voice calling out. I wouldn't stand so close to the edge if I were you. We turned to see a man emerging from the trees. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in the uniform of a county sheriff, his hand resting casually on his holstered weapon. His face was weathered, with deep lines around his eyes that suggested both age and habitual squinting against the sun. Sheriff Burke, I said, recognizing him from news photos related to Emily Thorne's disappearance. He nodded, his expression neutral but his eyes sharp and assessing. And you would be Dr. Foster.
And you would be Dr. Foster. Margaret called to say you were asking questions about the pond. His gaze shifted to Daniel. And you must be Mr. Wright. News travels fast in small towns. I straightened, moving a few steps back from the water's edge, noting that the mist had receded as soon as the sheriff appeared, settling back into formless drifts above the pond's surface. We're conducting research on historical patterns in the area, I said, adopting my professional tone. The pond features prominently in local records, Sheriff Burke's expression remained impassive, but something flickered in his eyes. Knowledge, or perhaps warning. Historical patterns, he repeated flatly. That's what you're calling it, not the disappearances, not Emily Thorne or the others before her. Daniel shifted beside me. We're interested in understanding what happened to them. Yes, the sheriff nodded slowly, his gaze drifting past us to the black water. Everyone who comes looking ends up with more questions than answers. This place doesn't give up its secrets easily. He walked closer, stopping at the edge of the barren ring surrounding the pond. I've lived in Blackwood my whole life, grew up hearing stories about this place, never believed them until I had to lead the search for Emily. His voice dropped slightly. 3 days we looked, dozens of volunteers, and all we found was that damn flashlight and her shoe, right about where you're standing now. I glanced down, suddenly uncomfortable with my position. The barren earth beneath my feet seemed to take on new significance. This was where Emily Thorne had last been, or at least where the last trace of her was found. Did you see anything unusual during the search? I asked, careful to keep my tone respectful rather than challenging. Sheriff Burke was silent for so long, I thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed, becoming almost distant, as if he were talking to himself rather than us. The mist, it wasn't like normal fog. It moved, wrong, followed us, and sounds didn't work right. You could be standing 10 feet from someone and barely hear them shouting. He cleared his throat, seeming to return to himself. Search and rescue said it was just the terrain, the acoustics of the valley, natural phenomena. But you don't believe that, Daniel said softly. The sheriff's eyes refocused, hardening. What I believe doesn't matter. What matters is that 17 people have gone missing here over the years, and not one body has ever been found. He gestured at the path behind him. It's going to be dark in a few hours. I suggest you head back to town. I had so many more questions, but his posture had shifted, becoming more official, more closed. This brief moment of openness was over. One more thing, Sheriff, I said as we gathered our equipment. Have you ever heard humming coming from the pond, or the forest? A woman's voice. His hand, which had been resting casually on his belt, suddenly tightened. Who told you about that? No one, I admitted. We heard it just before you arrived. Sheriff Burke's expression darkened. Then you've already stayed too long. That sound, he broke off, glancing at the pond as if worried it might be listening. People who follow that sound don't come back. Remember that. He waited until we had started back along the trail before adding, and if you hear it in town from your room at night, close the window, lock the doors. Don't listen to it, no matter how beautiful it sounds, or how much you want to follow it. With that unsettling warning, he turned and headed back toward town by a different path, leaving us to make our way through the increasingly shadowed forest. As we walked, I replayed the encounter in my mind. Sheriff Burke had all but confirmed the supernatural nature of what was happening at Widow's Pond, a surprising admission from a law enforcement official. His warning about the humming sound was particularly telling, not a dismissal of our experience as imagination or natural phenomena, but an acknowledgement of its danger. He's afraid, Daniel observed quietly, as we navigated the overgrown path. Not just concerned or uneasy, genuinely afraid. I nodded, and he didn't try to dissuade us from our investigation, just warned us about specific dangers, almost as if he hopes we'll figure it out. Daniel suggested, find answers where he couldn't. The thought was both encouraging and intimidating. If even the local authorities, with their resources and lifetime of regional knowledge, had failed to understand what was happening in Blackwood, what chance did 2 outside researchers have? Yet there was also opportunity in our outsider stat. We could ask questions that might be taboo for locals. We could approach the mystery without the weight of personal history or community pressure. The forest grew darker as we walked,
the sun dropping faster than seemed natural. Shadows lengthened and deepened, filling the spaces between trees with pools of inky blackness. The temperature continued to drop, our breath beginning to fog in the chill air. "We need to pick up the pace," Daniel said, checking his watch with a frown. "It shouldn't be getting dark this quickly." He was right. According to my own watch, it was barely 4 p.m. Yet the light was fading as if it were already dusk. I quickened my steps, feeling a prickling sensation between my shoulder blades, as if something were watching us from those deepening shadows. The main trail, when we finally reached it, was easier to follow but no less eerie. The forest around us had fallen completely silent. No birds, no insects, not even the sound of wind in the branches. The only noise was our own footsteps and increasingly labored breathing as we half walked, half jogged toward the trailhead. We were perhaps a quarter mile from the car when Daniel suddenly stopped, grabbing my arm. "Listen," he whispered. I held my breath, straining to hear whatever had caught his attention. At first there was nothing, just that unnatural silence pressing against my eardrums. Then I heard it, a soft, rhythmic crunching of leaves and twigs. Footsteps coming from the forest to our right, moving parallel to the trail. Something was pacing us, just out of sight among the trees. "Could be a deer," I whispered, though I didn't believe it. Deer moved differently, with a lighter bounding step. These footsteps were deliberate, measured, human, except there was something not quite right about their rhythm. A slight drag between steps, as if whatever was making them was injured, or not entirely human. We stood frozen for several seconds, listening as the footsteps continued, then gradually slowed to a stop. Whatever it was had halted as well, waiting. Daniel's hand found mine, squeezing once. Without a word, we began moving again, faster now, no longer trying to be quiet. The footsteps resumed immediately, keeping pace, drawing slightly closer to the trail. Then came the humming, that same melodic, feminine sound we'd heard at the pond, but closer now, weaving through the trees alongside us. It was beautiful and terrible, a song without words, that spoke directly to something primal in my brain, urging me to stop, to turn, to follow it into the darkness. I kept my eyes fixed on the trail ahead, focusing on the physical sensation of my feet hitting the ground, my hand gripping Daniel. The rational part of my mind was cataloging the experience: auditory hallucination, group hysteria, infrasound-induced paranoia. But a deeper, more instinctive part knew these explanations were inadequate. Something was calling to us from the forest, something that wanted us to leave the safety of the trail. The humming grew louder, more insistent. From the corner of my eye, I caught a flash of movement among the trees, a pale figure, glimpsed for just an instant before it vanished behind a massive oak. Daniel saw it too. His hand tightened convulsively around mine. We abandoned all pretense of calm research now, breaking into a full run, branches whipping at our faces as we pounded down the trail. The humming followed, keeping pace effortlessly. It was joined by another sound, a whispering that seemed to come from directly beside my ear, though there was nothing there when I jerked my head to look. "Abigail," the voice whispered, soft and enticing. "Stay with us, we have so much to show you." How did it know my name? My rational mind struggled to process this new impossibility even as we ran. The trailhead appeared ahead, the small clearing where we'd parked, visible through the thinning trees. Just 100 yards more, 50, 20, we burst out of the forest into the clearing, gasping for breath. The car sat exactly where we'd left it, looking impossibly normal and mundane after what we'd just experienced. I turned, half expecting to see some ghostly figure emerging from the trees in pursuit, but the forest edge was still and empty, the path we'd just traveled showing no sign of anything unusual. Even the unnatural darkness seemed to have receded, the late afternoon sun breaking through the canopy in dappled patterns that looked almost cheerful. Only the humming remained, now distant and fading, like a radio being turned down gradually until it was gone. We didn't speak as Daniel unlocked the car with shaking hands. There would be time for analysis later when we were safely back in town. For now, all that mattered was putting distance between ourselves and whatever had chased us through the forest. As we drove away, I looked back one last time at the trailhead sign with its simple map showing the path to Widow's Pond. In the golden light of the setting sun, it looked harmless, just another hiking trail in another forest. But I knew better now. We both did. Something waited in Blackwood Forest, something that knew my name and wanted me to follow, and I had the terrible feeling that sooner or later I would have no choice but to answer its call. Chapter 3. Whispers and Warnings. We maintained our silence until we were well clear of the forest, the car winding along the dirt road back toward town. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful under other circumstances. Daniel was the first to speak, his voice strained but steady. That was not what I expected. A laugh bubbled up from my chest, nervous, slightly hysterical. I think that's putting it mildly. He glanced at me, then back at the road. You heard it say your name. I nodded, the memory of that whispered Abigail sending fresh chills down my spine. Did it speak to you too? Yes. His knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. It said something about answers, that all my questions would be answered if I followed. He shook his head. It knew exactly what would tempt me most. That was disturbing. Not just that the voice had spoken to us both, but that it had tailored its message so specific. It suggested intelligence, purpose, not just some random supernatural phenomenon, but something that could read us, understand our deepest motivations. We need to document this while it's fresh, I said, reaching for my recorder. Compare experiences, look for patterns. Daniel nodded, visibly relieved to shift into research mode, to apply methodology to madness. It was a coping mechanism I understood well. Analyzing the impossible made it manageable, kept fear at bay. We spent the drive back to town recording our individual experiences, noting similarities and differences. We both heard the humming, both seen the pale figure among the trees, both experienced the unnatural darkness and silence. But the whispered messages had been personalized, speaking to our specific desires and fears. As we approached the town, the familiar buildings coming into view, I felt some of the tension leave my body. There was safety in civilization, in streetlights and people, and the mundane reality of small town life. But that safety was an illusion. Whatever lurked in Blackwood Forest had reached Emily Thorne and 16 others before her. Distance from the pond wasn't necessarily protection. We parked at the inn and made our way inside, both of us exhausted despite the relatively early hour. The common areas were empty. The dinner service apparently concluded while we were in the forest. Margaret looked up from her crossword as we passed the front desk, her expression unreadable. "Sheriff Burke called," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "Said you might want something stronger than coffee when you got back." She produced a bottle of whiskey from beneath the counter along with 2 glasses. "On the house," she added, sliding them toward us. "People usually need it after visiting that place." I took the bottle gratefully, noting the way her eyes lingered on our muddy boots and disheveled appearance. She knew exactly what we'd experienced, or could guess close enough. "Does everyone who goes there hear it?" I asked. The humming. Margaret's expression tightened. "Not everyone," she said after a moment. "Just the ones at once." Before I could ask what she meant, she turned away, busying herself with paperwork in a clear dismissal. The conversation was over. We took the whiskey upstairs to Daniel's room, which was larger than mine, and had a small table where we could spread out our notes. For the next hour we documented everything in meticulous detail. The temperature changes, the compass malfunctions, the EMF reading. The objective data was grounding, a reminder that despite the seemingly supernatural nature of our experience, there were measurable physical components to it. I keep coming back to the selectivity of it, Daniel said as he poured us each another finger of whiskey. Margaret said it doesn't call to everyone. Sheriff Burke implied the same thing. So what's the selection criteria? Why us? I had been wondering the same thing. Maybe it's related to susceptibility. Some people might be more sensitive to whatever frequencies or energies are involved. Or maybe it's drawn to people who are looking for it. Daniel suggested. We went there specifically to investigate the disappearances. We opened ourselves to the experience in a way that casual hikers might not. That made a certain sense. Intention and attention were powerful psychological forces. If you expected to see ghosts, you were more likely to interpret ambiguous stimuli as spectral in nature, but that didn't explain the specificity of what we'd experienced. The way it knew our names, the personalized whisper. We need more information, I decided. Historical accounts from people who've encountered the phenomenon and survived. There must be records. Oral histories at least. Daniel nodded. The town library tomorrow. Alice Mercer, the librarian. You mentioned she maintains the historical archive, and she's rumored to have her own theories about the disappearances, I added, though she might not be willing to share them with outsiders. We fell into silence, each lost in our own thought. The whiskey had helped with the initial shock, but the experience in the forest had fundamentally altered something in me. I had come to Blackwood as a researcher, believing that the disappearances, while genuinely mysterious, would have some natural explanation, perhaps environmental, perhaps psychological, but ultimately comprehensible within the framework of established science. Now I wasn't so sure. What we had experienced went beyond what conventional science could easily explain. The selective communication, the manipulation of perception, the apparent intelligence behind the phenomenon. These suggested something far more complex than toxic gases, causing hallucinations or geomagnetic anomalies, creating feelings of dread. What if it's real? I said finally, voicing the question that had been growing in my mind. What if whatever is happening in Blackwood is genuinely supernatural, beyond our current scientific understanding? Daniel didn't look surprised by the question. Then we need to approach it with new tools, not just EMF meters and thermometers, but, I don't know, whatever methodologies might apply to studying something outside conventional physics, like parapsychology, I suggested. Remote viewing protocols, spirit communication techniques. I smiled wryly. All the things my academic colleagues ridicule. Exactly. Daniel leaned forward, energized. Despite our exhaustion, we abandon preconceptions, follow the evidence wherever it leads. If conventional science can't explain what's happening here, maybe unconventional approaches can. It was both exhilarating and terrifying to consider. My entire career had been built on bringing scientific rigor to the study of supposedly paranormal phenomena, finding the rational explanations behind ghost stories and urban legend. If Blackwood truly represented something beyond current scientific understanding, it could validate my work in unprecedented ways, or it could destroy my credibility entirely. If I made claims that couldn't be substantiated with evidence acceptable to the scientific community. Our planning session was interrupted by a sound from outside, a soft, musical chiming that floated through the partially open window. We both froze, exchanging alarmed glances, but it wasn't the humming from the forest. This was different. A simple tune played on what sounded like a small music box, hauntingly sweet, but ordinary, human. Daniel crossed to the window and looked out. There's someone in the garden, he reported, an old man, sitting on a bench with what looks like a music box. I joined him at the window. Sure enough, Joseph Thorne sat alone in the inn's small garden, a tiny silver object, glinting in his hands. As he wound it up again, the melody repeated, drifting up to us in the still night. Emily's music box, I realized, recalling a detail from the police reports. She had it with her the night she disappeared. It was the one personal item that wasn't found at the pond. Daniel frowned. So how does he have it? Good question. I watched the old man for a moment long. He seemed unaware of our observation, his attention fixed entirely on the small silver box in his gnarled hands. Maybe we should ask him, We headed downstairs and out into the garden. The night air was cool, but not unpleasant, carrying the scent of late blooming flowers and distant wood smoke. Joseph Thorne didn't look up as we approached, his pale eyes reflecting the moonlight as he stared at the music box. "Mr. Thorne," I said softly, "may we join you?" He glanced up then, his expression distant. "You went to the pond," he said, not a question. "You heard her." I sat on the bench beside him, while Daniel remained standing. "We heard something," I acknowledged, "a humming sound, a voice that knew our names." Joseph nodded, unsurprised. "She knows everyone who comes looking, all of them do." His fingers caressed the music box. "This was Emily. Her grandmother gave it to her when she was 6. She took it everywhere. It wasn't found with her other belongings," I said gently. A smile flickered across his weathered face. "No, she brought it back to me 3 nights after she disappeared, left it on my porch with a note." He reached into his pocket and produced a small folded piece of paper, yellowed with age, despite being only 3 years old. I took it carefully, unfolding it to reveal a few lines written in delicate feminine handwriting. "Grandpa, don't worry about me, I'm still here, just on the other side. Keep my music box until I can come home for good. I'll visit when the moon is dark and the door is open. Love always, Emily." I passed the note to Daniel, watching his expression as he read it. Skepticism, confusion, then a reluctant fascination. "Thorne," he said, choosing his words carefully, "do you believe this note was actually written by your granddaughter after her disappearance?" Joseph took the note back, refolding it with reverent precision. "I know it was, just like I know it's her voice in the forest, Emily's voice, and Elizabeth's, and all the others, calling from the other side." "The other side of what?" I asked. He looked at me then, really looked at me, those pale eyes suddenly sharp and present. "The veil, the barrier, the door, whatever you want to call it. There's a place where our world touches another. Widow's Pond is the center of it, but the border gets thin other places too when conditions are right." "During the dark moon," I said, remembering his earlier words. "Yeah, and at certain spots in town, places where the boundary wears thin from frequent crossings." He pointed toward the forest, barely visible as a dark mass beyond the town's edge. "They can reach further during the dark moon, call to people from their homes, their dream." Daniel had taken out his notebook, dropping any pretense that this was just a casual conversation. "You said they can reach further. Who are they, Mr. Thorne? The missing people, or something else?" Joseph's expression darkened. "Both. Neither. It's complicated." He wound the music box again, the sweet melody filling the silence as he gathered his thoughts. "The people who disappear, they change, become something else, part of something else, but they remember who they were, want to share what they've found." "Found where?" I pressed. "Where do they go?" "The underneath," he said simply. "That's what Emily calls it. The world beneath ours, older than ours, where things are different, where time works differently." He smiled sadly. "She says it's beautiful there, peaceful, but she misses me, visits, when she can." I wanted to believe he was just a grieving old man who had created an elaborate fantasy to cope with his loss, but after what we'd experienced in the forest, I couldn't dismiss his words so easily. "The disappearances happen in clusters, groups of 3 to 5 people, separated by years." "Why is that?" Joseph nodded, as if pleased by the question. "The door only opens completely once every cycle. The dark moon brings weak spots, but for the door to open fully, the pattern must be complete." "What pattern?" Daniel asked. "The sacrifice pattern, blood and bone and breath, freely given. Each one strengthens the connection, thins the veil a little more. When enough have crossed over willingly, the door can open both ways." He looked up at the sky, where the moon was a thin crescent, waning toward darkness. "It's almost time. The cycle is nearly complete." A chill ran through me, that had nothing to do with the night air. "You're saying the people who disappeared went willingly, that they chose to vanish?" "Most of them." Joseph's fingers stilled on the music box. "Not all. Some were persuaded, confused, but they had to cross of their own accord. That's the rule." That's why the calling, the humming, it has to entice, not force. Daniel and I exchanged glances. The implications were disturbing on multiple levels. Mr. Thorne, I said carefully, if what you're saying is true, then the next dark moon could mark the completion of the current cycle. When is that? 3 days from now. His pale eyes fixed on mine. They'll be calling strongly then. Both of you heard them today, which means they want you, have chosen you. His gaze shifted to Daniel. You should leave Blackwood before then. Go far away. Don't come back until the moon is full again. With that ominous warning, he closed the music box with a snap and rose from the bench. I'm tired now. Need to rest. Emily visits my dreams on nights like this. We watched him shuffle back toward town. He had a small house near the church, I recalled from my research. As he disappeared into the darkness, the implications of his words hung between us like a physical presence. If there's any truth to what he's saying, Daniel finally broke the silence. We're in serious danger. I nodded slowly, but we're also on the verge of documenting something unprecedented. If the door really does open during the next dark moon, we could witness whatever happened to those 17 missing people. Daniel finished, maybe even understand it. The academic in me, the researcher who had dedicated her career to understanding the inexplicable, was thrilled by the possibility. But another part, the part that had felt primal terror in the forest today, warned that some knowledge came at too high a price. We need more information. I decided, corroboration from other sources, historical precedent. If Joseph Thorne's experiences are legitimate, there should be similar accounts from others who've encountered the phenomenon. Agreed. Library tomorrow, then more interviews. Anyone connected to previous disappearances who's still living in Blackwood. Daniel's expression was resolute, and we need to prepare. If we're going to be here during the dark moon, we should have protective measures in place. Like what? Salt circles and iron amulets. I smiled, trying to lighten the mood, but the joke fell flat. After what we'd experienced today, such folkloric protections didn't seem quite so ridiculous, like recording equipment that can withstand electromagnetic interference, like telling someone outside Blackwood where we are, and what we're doing, like having a clear exit strategy if things get out of control. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I was beginning to recognize as a sign of stress. I'm not saying we run away, I'm saying we go in prepared. He was right. Whatever was happening in Blackwood, whatever had called to us from the forest, with impossible knowledge of our names and desires, was dangerous. 17 people had already disappeared. We could easily become 18 and 9.
Yet neither of us suggested leaving. The mystery had its hooks in us now, a compulsion deeper than academic curiosity. I told myself it was professional commitment, the chance to document something truly extraordinary. But part of me wondered if it was already the influence of that hypnotic humming, drawing us towards some fate we couldn't yet comprehend. We said goodnight at my door, both exhausted from the day's events but buzzing with nervous energy. I knew sleep would be difficult, my mind racing with questions and theories in the memory of that whispering voice saying my name. I secured my room methodically, locked the door, closed and latched the window, even wedged a chair under the doorknob for good measure. Childish, perhaps, but comforting. Then I set up my laptop and began transcribing my recordings from the day, organizing my notes into coherent documentation. It was nearly 2 a.m. when I finally lay down, too tired to continue but still wired. My body aching from the hike but my mind refusing to quiet. Through the closed window, I could hear the normal sounds of night, distant owls, the occasional car on the main road, the soft lapping of Miller's Lake against the shore. Then those sounds faded, replaced by familiar silence, that same unnatural quiet we'd experienced in the forest. My muscles tensed, every sense suddenly alert. It came as I knew it would, the humming, softer than before, but unmistakable. A woman's voice, melodic and enticing, singing a wordless tune that seemed to bypass my ears and resonate directly in my mind. I pulled the covers tighter, focusing on my breathing, on the physical sensation of the bed beneath me. Real things, concrete things. The humming continued, neither growing louder nor fading away, just persistent, patient. Wait, then words began to form within the melody, soft and clear. Abigail, we've been waiting for so long. Come see what we've discovered. Come learn our secrets. I pressed my hands over my ears, knowing even as I did that it was futile. The voice wasn't coming from outside my room, wasn't something that could be blocked by physical barriers. You've spent your whole life looking for proof of things beyond human understanding. We can show you. We can open your eyes to wonders you've only imagined. The voice was right. I had dedicated my career to searching for evidence of phenomena that defied conventional explanation, and now that evidence was literally calling to me, offering exactly what I'd always wanted, which made it all the more dangerous. Not tonight, I said aloud, my voice sounding strange in the quiet room. Not like this. The humming paused, as if considering my response. Then it resumed, the melody shifting to something sadder, almost mournful. 3 nights until the door opens. Abigail, 3 nights to decide. After that, the chance will be gone for years. Think of everything you'll never know, never understand. All the questions that will go unanswered. It was the perfect temptation, tailored precisely to my deepest intellectual desires. Knowledge, understand answers to questions that had driven my research for years. I'll find my answers, I replied, surprised by the steadiness in my voice, but on my terms, through my research, not by following voices in the night. The humming faded then reluctantly, like an outgoing top. The normal night sounds gradually returned. The owls, the distant traffic, the water against the shore. I lay awake for a long time afterward, wondering if I had actually spoken aloud to an empty room, or if something had truly been there, listening, tempting, planned. When I finally slept, I dreamed of Widow's Pond, but in the dream, the water wasn't still. It moved in slow, deliberate patterns, forming shapes that almost resolved into faces. 17 faces, watching me from beneath the black surface, waiting for me to join them. In the dream, I knew with absolute certainty that I woke with a start, sunlight streaming through the curtains I'd forgotten to close completely. For a moment I lay disoriented, the dream of Widow's Pond still vivid in my mind. Those faces beneath the water, my certainty that I would join them, the memory sent a chill through me despite the warm morning light. Checking my phone, I saw it was already past 9. I'd overslept, unusual for me even after a disturbed night. Outside my window, Blackwood was alive, with the mundane sounds of small-town morning cars passing, distant conversations, a dog barking somewhere down the street. The normalcy was reassuring after the strangeness of the previous day and night. I showered quickly, trying to wash away the lingering unease from my dreams. As the hot water pounded against my skin, I replayed yesterday's events at the pond, searching for rational explanations. The temperature drops could be explained by microclimate effect. The EMF spikes might be caused by mineral deposits or underground water currents. Even the mist could be a natural phenomenon related to the pond's unique geography. But the humming, the voice that knew my name, the way it had spoken directly to my deepest desires, both at the pond and later in my room, these were harder to rationalize away. By the time I dressed and headed downstairs, I had composed myself enough to approach the day with professional focus. Daniel was already in the dining room, nursing a cup of coffee, and making notes in his journal. He looked up as I entered, dark circles under his eyes, suggesting his night had been no more restful than mine. "You heard it too," he said without preamble. I nodded, sliding into the chair across from him. "Around 2 in the morning, it spoke to me again. Same here. Told me 3 nights until the door opens." He pushed a cup of coffee toward me, just like Joseph Thorne said. Margaret appeared with a plate of eggs and toast before I could respond. She set it down without comment, but her eyes lingered on us a moment longer than necessary, her expression unreadable. "Did you sleep well?" she asked, the commonplace question carrying unexpected weight. "Well enough," I lied, though I had some strange dream. Something flickered in her eyes, recognition perhaps. "Dreams are active in this town," she said cryptically, "especially as the dark moon approaches." So she knew about that too. I wondered just how much the townspeople understood about what was happening in their community. How many of them had heard the humming, been tempted by those whispered promises. "We're headed to the library today," Daniel said, watching Margaret carefully, "to look through the historical archives." She nodded slowly. "Alice will help you. She knows more about the town's history than anyone." She hesitated, then added, "Ask her about Elizabeth Blackwood, the original widow." With that, she turned and headed back to the kitchen, leaving us to exchange puzzled glances. "Elizabeth Blackwood," I repeated, "the town's namesake, presumably." "I haven't come across much about her in my research so far." "Me neither." Daniel finished his coffee. "But if Margaret thinks she's relevant to understanding the disappearances, then we definitely need to learn more about her." I agreed. "Library first, then more interviews this afternoon." We finished breakfast quickly and set out for the Blackwood Public Library, a charming red brick building in the town's center. The morning was bright and clear, making last night's experiences seem almost dreamlike in their unreality. Yet the recorder in my bag contained evidence of what we'd heard at the pond, and both of us had experienced the same phenomenon in our rooms. The library was quiet and cool, scented with old books and furniture polish. A few patrons browsed the shelves or worked at the computer stations, but the building had the hushed, empty feeling of a place more valued than you. Alice Mercer sat behind the front desk, a thin woman in her 60s with silver-streaked black hair and sharp, intelligent eyes behind round glasses. She looked up as we entered, recognition dawning immediately. "Dr. Foster and Mr. Wright," she said, setting aside her book. "Margaret called to say you might be stopping by." News really did travel fast in small towns, or perhaps our investigation was a subject of particular interest among Blackwood's residents. "We're hoping to access the historical archives," I explained, "particularly any information related to Widow's Pond and the disappearances." Alice's expression didn't change, but her posture stiffened slightly. "The archives are in the basement, not open to the general public, but I can make an exception for academic research." She stood, gesturing for us to follow. "What exactly are you looking for?" "Information about the patterns of disappearances," Daniel replied, as we followed her toward a door marked "Staff Only," "and about Elizabeth Blackwood, the original widow." Alice paused, her hand on the door. "Margaret suggested that, did she?" When we nodded, she sighed. "Well, I suppose it was inevitable. You went to the pond, heard the calling, and now you're being drawn deeper, just like all the others." The matter-of-fact way she said it sent a chill through me. "You speak as if this is a known progression." "It is." She pushed open the door, revealing a narrow staircase leading down. "First the curiosity, then the visit to the pond, then the calling at night, then the research into Elizabeth. It's always the same pattern." She flicked on the lights, illuminating the stairs, "and it always ends the same way, with disappearance," Daniel said quietly. Alice glanced back at us. "Not always. Some resist. Some leave town before the dark moon. Some—" She trailed off, descending the stairs without finishing her thought. The basement was larger than I expected, with rows of metal shelving containing boxes, binders,
and leather-bound books. A central work table with 4 chairs stood beneath fluorescent lights that gave the windowless room a clinical brightness. The town records go back to 1802, when Blackwood was officially founded, Alice explained, moving to a specific section of shelving, but the area was settled earlier, mostly by trappers and a few farming families. The Blackwoods were among the She pulled down several boxes and a large, ancient-looking leather volume. This is Elizabeth Blackwood's journal, or what remains of it. Parts were damaged in a fire in 1893, and some pages appear to have been deliberately removed. But what's left tells quite a story. She set the journal on the table with reverent care. Elizabeth came here with her husband Thomas in 1796. They built a home near what we now call Widow's Pond, though it had another name then. What was it called? I asked, already reaching for the journal. The Doorway, Alice said simply. At least, that's what the indigenous people of the region called it. They avoided the area entirely, considered it sacred but dangerous. She continued pulling materials from the shelves as we examined the journal, its leather cover cracked with age, the pages brittle and yellow. The handwriting was elegant, but difficult to decipher, written in the formal style of the late 18th century. Elizabeth began reporting strange occurrences almost immediately after they settled. Alice continued. Voices in the forest, music with no source, lights over the pond at night. She set down another box. Initially, her husband dismissed her accounts as feminine fancy or the normal sounds of an unfamiliar wilderness, but eventually he began experiencing the phenomena too. I had found an entry from October 1797 that seemed to confirm this. Thomas has finally admitted to hearing the music I have described. These many months, he was returning from hunting yesterday eve when it came to him, a woman's voice, singing without words. He followed at some distance before coming to his senses. Now he no longer looks at me with such concern when I speak of these things. What happened to them? Daniel asked, looking up from a stack of yellowed newspaper clippings. Alice's expression grew solemn. Thomas disappeared in the spring of 1798, near the pond. The official account was that he drowned, though his body was never recovered. Elizabeth became increasingly obsessive after that, spent hours at the pond, claimed to communicate with Tom, said he was on the other side, but could still reach her somehow. She pulled out another smaller journal. This belonged to Reverend James Porter, who ministered to the early settlement. He documented his concerns about Elizabeth's mental state, her claims about the pond, and what she called the underneath. I felt a jolt of recognition at the term, the same one Joseph Thorne had used the night before when describing where his granddaughter had gone. Elizabeth became quite influential in the growing settlement, Alice continued. She was educated, wealthy from her husband's estate, and developed a reputation for uncanny insights and predictions. Some called her a witch, but most respected her. When the town was officially established, it was named for her family. And the disappearances, Daniel prompted. When did they start? Almost immediately after Thomas, Alice confirmed. A pattern of 3 to 5 people every 20 years or so, always the same. They would report hearing music or voices, become preoccupied with the pond, and then vanish without a trace. Some left notes, claiming they were going to join loved ones who had disappeared before. She handed us a folder containing what appeared to be handwritten police reports from the 1800s and early 1900s. The town has tried various measures over the years, fencing off the pond, posting guards during the dark moon, even trying to drain it once in night. Nothing worked. The fence was repeatedly breached. The guards reported being called away by voices, and the attempt to drain the pond was abandoned when 3 workers disappeared simultaneously. I was skimming Elizabeth's journal, looking for more direct descriptions of her experience. Many entries were mundane accounts of daily pioneer life, but interspersed were passages that sent chills down my spine. May 15, 1798. I know now where Thomas has gone. The voice in the water showed me glimpses of that other world, that elder place that exists beneath our. It is beautiful beyond description, filled with lights and beings of impossible form. Thomas walks among them now, changed, but recognizable. He calls to me nightly, beckons me to join him. Soon I shall, but there is work to be done first. The doorway requires preparation. June 3, 1798. Another has gone through. Young Mary Collins, who lost her child and husband to the fever last winter. She heard the calling and came to me for understanding. I showed her the way, the proper words and movements to open her perception. She saw what I had seen and chose to cross. The doorway grows stronger with each passage. In time, it will open fully, allowing free movement between the worlds. The implications were disturbing. If Elizabeth's account was accurate, she hadn't just experienced the phenomenon, she had facilitated it, encouraged others to cross over. She was describing not just a haunting or natural anomaly, but a deliberate process of opening what she believed to be a doorway between worlds. There's more, Alice said, noting my expression as I read. Elizabeth eventually disappeared herself, but before she did, she established a sort of cult, is too strong a word, a circle of knowledge keepers, people who understood what the pond represented, and helped others who were called to make the crossing. Are you saying this circle still exists? Daniel asked, his voice carefully neutral. Alice didn't answer directly. The town has always had those who understand the true nature of Widow's Pond. Some fear it, some revere it. Most prefer not to think about it at all. She adjusted her glasses, but every generation, the calling comes, and those who hear it must make their choice. The way she spoke, with personal certainty rather than academic distance, raised a question I couldn't ignore. Have you heard it, Miss Mercer? The calling. Her eyes met mine, clear and untroubled. When I was 17, during the dark moon cycle of night, 4 people disappeared that year. A small smile touched her lips. I chose to stay, to learn, to preserve the knowledge for those who would need it later. Like us, I realized, she had been expecting us, or people like us, researchers who would be drawn into the mystery. What exactly is? Daniel asked, his natural scientific skepticism asserting itself. This doorway or portal or whatever it's supposed to be, is there any objective evidence of its existence, beyond the 17 people who have vanished without a trace? Alice's tone was mild. The consistent EMF anomaly, the documented temperature fluctuations, the audio recordings of voices that contain no recognizable language yet convey meaning directly to the listener's mind. She shook her head. What would constitute objective evidence of something that exists partially outside our normal reality? It was a fair point, and one that highlighted the fundamental challenge of our research. How do you scientifically document and analyze phenomena that seem to operate outside the established laws of physics? Is it dangerous? I asked, returning to a more practical concern. If we continue investigating, if we're still here during the dark moon, are we at risk? Alice was silent for a moment, considering her response. Yes and no, she finally said. No one is ever taken who doesn't choose to go. That's fundamental to how the doorway works. It requires free will. She leaned forward slightly, but the calling is persuasive. It knows what you desire most, what would tempt you to cross over, and it becomes stronger as the dark moon approaches. So the danger is essentially one of temptation, Daniel summarized. Being convinced to walk into the pond voluntarily. Essentially, yes. Alice nodded. Though walking into the pond isn't quite right, the physical location is just where the boundary is thinnest. The actual crossing is more perceptual, a shifting of awareness that allows you to step from one reality into another. She began returning materials to their shelves, except for Elizabeth's journal and a few folders of more recent documents. You can study these here. I'll be upstairs if you need anything else. At the foot of the stairs, she paused. And Dr. Foster, Mr. Wright, a word of caution. Knowledge about the doorway can be compelling. The more you understand it, the stronger its pull becomes. Just be aware of that as you With that unsettling warning, She left us alone with Elizabeth Blackwood's journal and 200 years of documented encounters with whatever waited beneath the black waters of Widow's Pond. We spent the next several hours immersed in the materials, taking photographs, and making notes of the most significant entry. The pattern Alice had described became increasingly clear. Clusters of disappearances, occurring approximately every 20 years, always preceded by reports of the calling, always culminating during a dark moon. What was less clear from the historical record was whether anyone had ever returned. There were scattered references to messengers and those who walked between, but nothing concrete enough to determine if these were people who had crossed over and come back, or something else entirely. By early afternoon, my eyes were burning from reading the faded handwriting, and my mind was swimming with information. We decided to break for lunch and discuss what we'd learned, planning to return to the archives after. The town diner was busy with the lunch crowd, mostly locals who gave us curious glances as we took a booth by the window. We ordered sandwiches and coffee, then spread our notes on the table, keeping our voices low, so Elizabeth Blackwood wasn't just a witness to the phenomenon. I summarized.
We're scientists, Daniel replied. Understanding this phenomenon could revolutionize multiple fields: physics, psychology, potentially even our understanding of consciousness itself. Yes, Sarah said softly. That's exactly the kind of temptation the calling uses. Knowledge, understanding. For my brother, it was wonder and beauty. He was an artist. For his wife, it was freedom from physical limitations. She had MS, was gradually losing motor function. Her gaze shifted between us. What is it promising you, I wonder? The question hung in the air, uncomfortably perceptive. The calling had promised me answers to questions that had driven my entire career. Proof of realities beyond conventional scientific understanding. To Daniel, it had offered resolution to his lifelong intellectual quest for knowledge beyond the boundaries of established physics. Perfect temptations, tailored precisely to our deepest desires. We should be going, I said, suddenly needing fresh air and distance from Sarah's knowing gaze. Thank you again for sharing your experiences. She walked us to the door, but paused before opening it. One last thing. If you decide to observe the dark moon at the pond, and I suspect you will, despite my warnings, take salt. Cast a circle around yourselves before the calling begins. It won't stop you from hearing or seeing, but it will give you a boundary, a moment of choice before crossing. Salt circles, Daniel murmured. Folk magic. Sarah's smile was sad. The oldest boundaries between worlds are often the simplest: salt, iron, running water. These things have power that predates our understanding of why. She opened the door. Whether you frame it as science or magic doesn't matter. What matters is that it works. As we walked back toward the library, I thought about her work. Throughout human history, across countless cultures, certain substances and practices had been used as protection against supernatural influences. Modern skepticism dismissed these as superstition, but what if they represented empirical knowledge passed down through generations who had encountered phenomena like what we were investigating in Blackwood? We should test it, I decided, tonight, when the humming salt circles, iron at the windows, controlled conditions, to see if they have any measurable effect on the intensity of the calling. Daniel nodded. And we should record everything: audio, EMF readings, temperature fluctuations, document the experience as thoroughly as possible. We spent the rest of the afternoon in the archives, focusing now on accounts of protective measures used against the calling. The records were fragmentary but suggestive, mentions of salt barriers that confused the voices, iron amulets that muffled the song, specific herbs burned to clear the air of influence. Alice Mercer provided additional materials without comment, though her knowing gaze suggested she understood exactly what we were researching and why. When we finally emerged from the basement archives late in the afternoon, she handed us a small book bound in faded blue leather. My personal notes, she explained, on previous Dark Moon events, including protective measures that have proven effective. I'd appreciate having it returned when you're finished. The gesture surprised me. Thank you, but why help us this? Alice adjusted her glasses, her expression thoughtful. Because knowledge should be preserved and shared. Because you're both researchers who might document this phenomenon in ways that future generations will need. She paused. And because choice requires understanding. Whatever you decide when the dark moon comes, it should be a fully informed decision. It was similar to what Sarah Walker had said. This emphasis on informed choice, as if the entire town were invested, not in preventing us from encountering the phenomenon, but in ensuring we understood it properly before we did. We thanked her and headed back to the inn, stopping at the general store to purchase salt, iron nails, and a few other items mentioned in the historical accounts. The shopkeeper, a weathered man in his 60s, rang up our purchases without comment, until we added a box of chalk to the pile, drawing the symbols. Are you? He asked, his tone carefully neutral. Research, Daniel replied vaguely. The man nodded. Best to get the curves right. Straight lines won't hold. He bagged our items efficiently. And remember, counterclockwise to open, clockwise to close. Always been that way. Before we could ask what he meant, another customer entered, and the shopkeeper turned his attention to them. We left with our supplies and the distinct impression that our activities were being observed and discussed throughout the town. Back at the inn, we commandeered a corner of the dining room to plan our approach for the evening. Margaret brought us coffee without being asked, her eyes flickering to our shopping bags with knowing recognition. Testing boundaries tonight, she asked, setting down the something like that, I admitted. Learning what works and what doesn't. She nodded. Smart. Better to know your protections before you really need them. She hesitated, then added, there's a full bathroom attached to the garden shed out back, if you need privacy for your work. More space than your rooms, and no shared walls. It was a surprisingly practical offer. Thank you, Margaret. That would be helpful. I'll unlock it after dinner. Just remember to clean up afterward. With that, she moved away to attend to other guests, leaving us to exchange bemused glance. Is the entire town part of this? Daniel muttered. Everyone seems to know exactly what we're doing and why. Small towns, I said with a shrug, but I think it's more than that. This phenomenon has been part of Blackwood for generations. They've developed ways of dealing with it, talking about it, and ways of facilitating it. Daniel added, don't forget Alice's comment about knowledge keepers who help people cross over. There's an infrastructure here, dedicated to managing whatever is happening at the pond. He was right, and it changed my perception of our investigation. We weren't simply documenting an obscure local mystery. We were interacting with a community that had been living with and adapting to an extraordinary phenomenon for centuries. After dinner, we gathered our equipment and supplies and headed for the garden shed Margaret had offered. It was larger than I expected, more of a small outbuilding than a true shed, with a comfortable sitting area and the promised bath. Windows looked out on the garden from 3 sides, while the 4th held a workbench and shelves stocked with gardening supplies and tools. Perfect, Daniel declared, setting down his bag. We can establish controlled conditions, document everything, and not disturb other guests if there are unusual effects. We worked methodically, setting up our recording equipment and arranging our protective elements according to the historical accounts. A circle of salt around the perimeter of the room, iron nails,
at each window and chalk symbols drawn on the floor near each corner. The counterclockwise spirals the shopkeeper had mentioned. By midnight, we were ready. The equipment was running. Baseline readings established for temperature, electromagnetic fields, and ambient set. We sat in the center of the salt circle on cushions borrowed from the garden furniture, waiting for the calling to begin. Should we do anything to invite it? Daniel wondered. Or just wait? Let's wait, I decided. If it's been finding us in our rooms, it can find us here. We didn't have to wait long. At approximately 12:17 a.m., the ambient temperature dropped by 3 degrees in less than a minute. The EMF meter began registering fluctuations, its needle moving in rhythmic patterns, unlike anything I'd seen before. Then came the silence, that same unnatural quiet we'd experienced in the forest, as if the world outside our circle had simply ceased to exist. The humming followed, starting almost imperceptibly but growing gradually loud, not from any specific direction, but seeming to emanate from the air itself. It's different than before, Daniel whispered. More harmonics, multiple voices. He was right. The humming wasn't a single voice tonight, but a chorus, 3 distinct tones, weaving together in complex patterns that made my skin prickle with goosebumps. Beautiful but alien, like music composed according to rules I couldn't comprehend. Recordings active, I confirmed, checking the equipment. EMF still spiking in rhythmic patterns. The humming continued for several minutes without words, just pure musical tones that seemed to bypass my ears and resonate directly in my belly.
The humming continued for several minutes without words, just pure musical tones that seemed to bypass my ears and resonate directly in my bones. Then, gradually, the voices began to differentiate, to take on distinct characteristics. Abigail, one called, the same voice I'd heard at the pond, feminine, alluring, somehow ancient despite its youthful timbre. You're learning our ways, beginning to understand. We've been waiting, another voice added, deeper, masculine, for minds like yours, seekers of truth. The third voice was different, neither male nor female, but something between or beyond those categories. 3 nights until the door opens. Will you be ready to see? Daniel's eyes were wide, his breathing shallow. You hear them too. 3 distinct voices. I nodded, making notes without looking down at my pad. Different from yesterday, more complex, more present. Your protections work, the feminine voice said, amusement coloring its tone. We cannot reach you directly, but we can still speak, still show you glimpses. The air within our circle seemed to thicken, shimmer like heat waves rising from summer pavement. Within that shimmer, images began to form, not solid or fully realized, but impressionable, like reflections in disturbed water. I saw structures that defied Euclidean geometry, buildings that seemed to fold in on themselves in impossible ways, lights that moved with apparent intelligence, communicating through patterns of flashing color, and beings shaped vaguely like humans, but with proportions that shifted as I watched, features that refused to resolve into anything recognizable. The underneath, the masculine voice explained, our home, soon to be yours, if you choose. Why, Daniel asked suddenly, his voice steady despite the strangeness surrounding us. Why are we hearing the calling? The third, genderless voice answered, because you seek, because you question, because you already stand with 1 foot in your world, and 1 in the spaces between. Scientists, the feminine voice added, explorers of reality's boundaries. We need such minds, such perspectives. The images shifted, showing what appeared to be humans moving among the strange beings, observing, interacting. Some retained human form entirely, others seemed partially transformed, their bodies adapting to the alien environment in gradual ways. Those who crossed before, the masculine voice explained. Some maintain their form, others evolve, all by choice. I found my voice, forcing myself to maintain scientific detachment despite the wonder and terror of what I was witnessing. The people who disappeared from Blackwood, they're still conscious, still themselves. In essence, the genderless voice replied, though self is more fluid in our reality, identity less fixed. The salt circle around us flared suddenly with pale blue light, causing the images to waver and recede. The voices grew fainter, as if being pulled back across some threshold. Your protections weaken our connection, the feminine voice said, sounding distant now, but we will return, each night stronger, until the dark moon opens the door fully. Remember, the masculine voice added, you must choose. The doorway requires consent. 3 nights, the third voice echoed. Prepare yourselves. The humming faded gradually, the multiple tones separating and diminishing until silence returned. The temperature in the room rose slowly back to normal, and the EMF meter settled to its baseline reading. For several minutes, Daniel and I sat motionless, processing what we had experienced. Finally, I reached for the recorder, confirming it had captured the entire encounter. Did you see the same things I did? I asked. The structures, the beings, the transformed humans. He nodded slowly. Yet, though I'm not sure see is the right word, it was more like concepts being translated into visual form my brain could process. That aligned with my own impression. The images had felt more like intuitive understanding than literal sight. My mind, constructing representations of information too alien for direct comprehension. The protections worked, I noted, gesturing to the salt circle that had briefly illuminated, not to block communication entirely, but to maintain a boundary. Just as Sarah said, Daniel was reviewing the EMF readings, his expression thoughtful. These patterns aren't random, there's a structure here. A language of sorts, encoded in the electromagnetic fluctuations. He was right. The readout showed distinct patterns, pulses, pauses, and intensity shifts that seemed deliberately organized. Not Morse code or any recognizable human system, but definitely structured communication. We should analyze this, I decided. Compare it to recordings from the pond. See if there are consistent patterns, and we should document everything we experienced, Daniel added. Every detail before memory fades. We spent the next 2 hours recording our observations, comparing notes, and reviewing the technical data. The temperature drop had been consistent with our previous experiences, but more pronounced. The EMF fluctuations showed similar patterns to those at the pond, but with greater complexity and intensity. Most significant was the audio recording. When we played it back, the humming was clearly audible, 3 distinct tones, just as we had heard, but the voices were absent, replaced by strange acoustic anomalies that sounded almost like language but not quite phonemes without semantic structure, organized in rhythmic patterns that mirrored human speech, without containing recognizable words. It's like the recording can capture the sound but not the meaning, I mused, as if the actual communication is happening on some level beyond mere acoustics, directly to our minds, Daniel suggested, using sound as a carrier wave, but not as the content itself. It was a fascinating hypothesis, aligned with what we knew of infrasound and its potential effects on human perception. Certain frequencies below the range of human hearing could induce psychological effects, including feelings of awe, fear, or even religious experience. Perhaps what we were encountering was a sophisticated application of similar principles, sound waves that affected consciousness directly, bypassing normal sensory process. We finished our documentation and cleaned up the shed as promised, carefully collecting the salt and removing the chalk markings. As we worked,
I couldn't shake the sense that we were being watched, not by any human observer, but by the entities from the underneath, as if our circle had opened a connection that hadn't fully closed. Do you feel it? I asked Daniel as we walked back to the inn, like we're being observed. He nodded, glancing over his shoulder at the darkened garden. Since the voices faded, a presence, a tension. The doorway is getting stronger, I murmured, just as they said, 3 nights, until it opens fully, which meant we had limited time to decide our course of action, continue investigating, gathering data until the dark moon, or leave Blackwood before the doorway opened completely, before the temptation became too strong to resist. As we entered the inn, I realized Margaret was still awake, sitting in the small front parlor with a book. She looked up as we passed, her eyes questioning. It worked, I said simply. The protections, thank you. She nodded, satisfied. Good. The first night is the easiest, becomes harder to resist as the dark moon approaches. She marked her place in her book and rose. Sleep well. If you can, dreams will be active tonight. It was another of her cryptic warnings, but I was beginning to understand their purpose, not to frighten us away, but to prepare us for what was coming, to ensure we faced it with knowledge rather than ignorance. In my room, I prepared for bed with mechanical movements, my mind still processing the night's revelations. The underneath was real, a parallel reality inhabited by entities that had been communicating with humans for centuries. People who crossed over, retained their consciousness, their sense of self, though that self might eventually transform into something new, and we had been chosen to receive the calling. For our scientific minds, our willingness to question established reality, our openness to the impossible. As I drifted towards sleep, one question circled in my thoughts. If we stayed until the dark moon, if we witnessed the doorway opening fully, would we be able to resist the temptation to cross over, to see for ourselves the wonders glimpsed in those shimmering visions? Sarah Walker had resisted. Others throughout Blackwood's history had chosen to stay, to document rather than experience. It was possible, but as sleep claimed me, the feminine voice whispered again at the edges of my consciousness. You've spent your life searching for proof of realities beyond the measure. Now it's offered freely. All you need do is step through. The dream began immediately, more vivid than any I'd experienced before. I stood at the edge of Widow's Pond, but it was transformed, the water crystal clear rather than murky black, revealing a perfect reflection of the night sky above. Stars shimmered both overhead and below my feet, as if the pond were a window rather than a surface. In that reflection the spiral symbol appeared, the same one from Sarah's note, from the carved tree. It pulsed with soft blue light, expanding gradually until it filled the water's surface entirely, and then it opened, like an eye blinking awake. Beyond it lay a vast landscape of impossible geometries and colors that had no names in human language. Beautiful and terrible, and utterly alien. Figures moved in that landscape, some recognizable as human, others decidedly not. Among them, I saw a young woman who could only be Emily Thorne, her features matching the photograph Joseph had shown us. She turned toward me, her eyes meeting mine across the threshold between worlds. It's not what you think, she said, her voice clear despite the distance. Neither heaven nor hell, just different, gloriously, terrifyingly different. Are you trapped? I asked. Can you return? Her smile was sad. I wouldn't return if I could, but yes, in a way we're trapped. Once adapted to this reality, the human form can't survive in yours. The physics are incompatible. Then why call to us? Why tempt people to cross? Because we need you, she replied simply. Your perspectives, your uniquely human ways of processing reality. We learn from you as you learn from us. Exchange, growth. Another figure approached behind her, a man with features that reminded me of David Walker from the photographs I'd seen, but his form seemed less solid, more fluid, his edges blurring into the strange environment around him. The transition has begun for me, he explained, noticing my gaze. Integration, becoming part of this place while retaining my consciousness. It's freeing and painful, Emily added. Terrifying sometimes, but worth it for what we gain. What do you gain? I asked. Understanding, David replied, of realities beyond our own, of consciousness that transcends physical form, of time as a dimension rather than a prison. Come, Emily said, extending her hand toward me. See for yourself, just for a moment, a glimpse only. I knew I shouldn't accept, knew the dangers of even this dream contact, but curiosity, that scientist's curse, overwhelmed caution. I reached out, my fingers extending toward the surface of the pond, toward Emily's outstretched hand. Our fingertips touched, and reality shattered. For an instant, that contained eternity, I perceived the underneath directly, without the filtering interface of human senses. It was vast beyond comprehension, complex beyond analysis, a reality where thought was substance, where consciousness shaped environment, rather than merely observing it, where time looped and branched, and sometimes ceased entirely, and the beings there, the true inhabitants, not the human visitors, were equally incomprehensible, not bodies but patterns of energy and information, constantly shifting, evolving, merging and separating in cosmic depth, yet somehow sentient, somehow aware, somehow capable of curiosity about the strange linear creatures that occasionally crossed into their domain. The experience was too much for my mind to process. I felt myself beginning to fragment, consciousness splintering under the weight of perceptions it was never designed to handle. Enough, a voice said, not Emily's or David's, but the third voice from our session, the one that was neither male nor female. She is not ready, not yet prepared. The connection broke, and I fell backward, away from the pond, away from the doorway. As I fell, I heard Emily's voice one last time. 3 nights. The choice comes, prepare or depart. I woke with a gasp, heart pounding, body drenched in sweat. The room was dark, the digital clock on the nightstand showing 3:17 a.m. Outside my window, the waning moon cast silver light across the garden, its crescent shape a reminder of the approaching dark moon. 3 nights. The calling was growing stronger, the glimpses more intense, and I had to decide whether to stay and face the final temptation or leave Blackwood before the doorway opened fully. The scientific opportunity was unprecedented. Direct contact with a parallel reality, with entities that defied our understanding of consciousness and existence. Data that could revolutionize multiple fields of study, but the risk was equally immense. 17 people had crossed over, unable to resist the calling. What made me think I would be any different? As I lay awake, watching the moon's slow progress across the sky, I realized that this was the true danger of Widow's Pond, not malevolent entities seeking to harm us, but the temptation of knowledge too profound to resist, the ultimate test of whether our curiosity would lead to discovery or destruction, and I had less than 3 days to prepare myself for that.
It started with a missed call at 3:17 a.m. from a number I didn't recognize. I almost ignored it until I noticed the area code belonged to Ravenswood, my childhood hometown, a place that shouldn't exist anymore. They demolished Ravenswood 15 years ago after the mining disaster. Every building, every street sign, every trace of human habitation gone. So how was someone calling me from a place that had been wiped off the map? I tried calling back the next morning. A woman answered on the third ring. Ravenswood Public Library. How may I direct your call? My blood ran cold. The library had burned down when I was 12, 3 years before the town itself disappeared. Hello? Is anyone there? The woman asked, her voice eerily familiar. I'm sorry, I managed to say. Who am I speaking with? This is Margaret Holloway. I'm the head librarian. She sounded impatient, as if I should know this. Margaret Holloway had been our neighbor. She died in the fire that consumed the library. I hung up. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw flames consuming the old brick library, heard the screams that had filled the air that night. I'd been across the street at Cooper's Ice Cream with my mother when the first smoke appeared. I remembered how she'd grabbed my arm, whispered, "Stay here," and ran toward the burning building. She'd known Margaret was inside. Mom made it back out with 3 children who'd been trapped in the reading room. But Margaret hadn't been so lucky. They found her body the next day, clutching a stack of rare books she'd tried to save. I gave up on sleep around 5 a.m. and made coffee. My apartment in Chicago felt suddenly cold despite the heat being on. I pulled up news archives on my laptop and searched for Ravenswood mining disaster. The results were sparse, a few articles about the catastrophic tunnel collapse, the failed rescue attempts, the decision to evacuate and eventually demolish the remaining structures. One grainy photo showed bulldozers taking down the remains of the town hall. Another showed the flooded valley after they'd created Lake Hollister. What none of the articles mentioned was what I knew firsthand, that half the town's residents had vanished before the demolition, not killed in the collapse, not evacuated, vanished, disappeared from locked homes, empty cars found running, my mother among them. The authorities had written them off as casualties, bodies unrecovered in the unstable mine tunnels, but I knew better. Mom had never gone near the mines that day. 3 days later I received a letter postmarked from Ravenswood. The date stamp read yesterday's date. Inside was a yellowed library card with my name on it and a handwritten note. Your books are overdue. Please return them immediately. Fines accrue daily. The handwriting matched my mother's exactly. I called my therapist, Dr. Winters. She'd helped me work through the trauma of losing my hometown and my mother when I was a teenager. She agreed to see me immediately. Alex, she said when I showed her the letter, this is concerning, but not for the reasons you think. Someone is playing an elaborate, cruel prank on you. The postmark is real, I insisted, and this is my mother's handwriting. I'd recognize it anywhere. Dr. Winters adjusted her glasses. The human mind is remarkably skilled at finding patterns it wants to see. You've been under stress at work recently. Sometimes that can reactivate old trauma pathways. She was referring to my recent promotion at the architectural firm where I worked. I'd been pulling 16-hour days designing a new civic center. This isn't because I'm stressed. Someone called me from Ravenswood, a town that doesn't exist. Have you considered that someone might have reused the old area code, or that you misremembered the number? I hadn't. It seemed too reasonable, too mundane an explanation, but I nodded anyway. Dr. Winters prescribed sleeping pills and suggested I take a few days off work. I agreed, but as I left her office, my phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. You forgot to return Legends of the Deep Places by E.L. Marsh. This was your mother's favorite. She read it to you every night when you were 7. My hand trembled. No one alive knew that detail. My mother had indeed read me that obscure book of folk tales, checked out from the Ravenswood Library repeatedly until Margaret Holloway had finally given us our own copy for Christmas. That book had disappeared along with my mother. That night, I dreamed of Ravenswood. In my dream, I walked down Main Street, past Elmer's Hardware and the Sundown Diner. Everything looked exactly as I remembered, except all the buildings were filled with water like enormous aquariums. Inside, people went about their daily lives, seemingly unaware they were submerged. My mother waved at me from behind the diner's counter, her hair floating around her face like seaweed. I woke up gasping for air, my pillow soaked with sweat, the sleeping pills useless. The next morning, I called in sick to work and drove to the university library. If someone was playing an elaborate hoax, I needed to understand why. I spent hours in the local history section, pulling every book and article I could find on Ravenswood. Most contained information I already knew. Founded in 1851 as a mining town, population peaked at 8,732 in the 1980s. Declined after the main vein of copper was exhausted, suffered catastrophic mine collapse in 2009, demolished to create reservoir in 2010. But one book, a self-published local history by Theodore Werner, contained details that made my skin crawl. Werner had been the town historian, an eccentric old man who lived in a Victorian house filled with artifacts and records. He died a month before the mine collapse. His book contained passages that none of the official histories mentioned. The original settlement of Ravenswood was not established in 1851 as commonly believed, but in 1832 by a splinter group from the Harmony Society led by Johannes Raven. This first attempt at colonization ended in disaster when all 27 settlers disappeared during the harsh winter of 1833. Only one survivor, a child named Elias Raven, was found by trappers in the spring, nearly feral and speaking an unrecognized language. The settlement that eventually became Ravenswood was established on the same site in 1851, after copper was discovered. Most historical records omit the first settlement entirely, as if history itself prefers to forget. Another passage described strange occurrences throughout the town's history. Every generation, Ravenswood has been plagued by disappearances. The missing are always found in the same condition, if they are found at all. Standing waist-deep in Crawford Creek, staring into the waters, unresponsive to all stimuli. Those recovered invariably die within days, their lungs mysteriously filled with water despite no signs of drowning. The final chapter contained a local legend that made me nearly drop the book. The miners have long spoken of something dwelling in the deep tunnels beneath Ravenswood, something that was there before the copper, before the town, perhaps before mankind itself. They call it the Waiting One, and leave small offerings before descending into the new tunnels. Coins, food, occasionally blood pricked from their own fingers. According to miners' lore, the Waiting One made a bargain with Johannes Raven, prosperity for the town in exchange for tribute. When Raven failed to deliver, his settlement was taken. The cycle has continued ever since. Prosperity followed by sacrifice, willingly or unwillingly given. The most disturbing aspect of this folklore is the specific nature of the tribute demanded. One who carries the waters within them. Local scholars have debated the meaning of this phrase for generations with no consensus. I photographed every page of Werner's book with my phone and headed home, my mind racing. On the way, I stopped at a convenience store for coffee. The cashier, a bored teenager, barely looked up as she rang me out. "That'll be $3.17, she said. I froze. "What did you say?" She looked confused. $3.17. I paid and hurried out, telling myself it was just a coincidence. But as I drove home, every digital clock I passed on bank signs on my car dashboard read 3:17 regardless of the actual time. When I got home, there were 3 voicemails on my phone, all from different Ravenswood numbers. I forced myself to listen to them one by one. The first was from Margaret Holloway. "Your books are 17 days overdue now. The fines are adding up." The second was from a man whose voice I didn't recognize. "The water levels are rising faster than predicted. The engineers are concerned about the old mine shafts. We need your expertise." The third was from my childhood best friend, Tommy Mercer. "Hey, where've you been? Everyone's looking for you. The whole town's gathering for the anniversary ceremony tonight. You need to come home. We can't start without you." Tommy had been with me the day of the mine collapse. We'd been exploring the old ventilation shafts when the first tremors hit. I made it out. Tommy didn't. I turned off my phone and poured myself a strong drink. As the whiskey burned down my throat, I admitted to myself what I'd been avoiding. I needed to go back to Ravenswood, or at least to where Ravenswood had been. But first, I needed to understand what I was dealing with. I spent the night researching folklore about water spirits, submerged towns, and mining disasters, making connections between Werner's book and older myths. Many cultures had stories of water-dwelling entities that lured people to watery deaths. The Celtic Ichuaskin, the Japanese Kappa, the Slavic Vaatianoi, all of them demanded sacrifices. All of them were associated with unnatural drownings.
Around 2 a.m. I found myself on obscure forums dedicated to disappearances around man-made lakes. One thread caught my attention: reservoir hauntings, the price of progress. A user named DeepDiver83 had compiled dozens of accounts of strange phenomena around artificial lakes created by flooding existing landscapes. People reported hearing church bells from submerged towns, seeing lights moving beneath the water, receiving phone calls from disconnected numbers with area codes belonging to the drowned communities. One comment made me spill my drink. My grandfather worked for the TVA in the 1940s, helping to create Norris Lake. He told me they didn't always give people enough notice before flooding. Some refused to leave their homes. The official records say everyone was evacuated, but he swore they closed the dam knowing some people were still there. He said sometimes, when the water is clear, you can see their descendants still living in the submerged houses, going about their business as if nothing changed. I was about to reply when a private message appeared from DeepDiver83. You're looking for answers about Ravenswood. I can help. Meet me at the Lake Hollister observation point tomorrow at sunset. Come alone. I hadn't mentioned Ravenswood anywhere in my browsing. I slammed my laptop shut. I packed a bag and started driving before dawn. According to maps, Ravenswood should have been replaced by Lake Hollister, a reservoir created after they flooded the remains of the town. But as I turned onto the old county road that once led to Ravenswood, the GPS signal died. The road shouldn't have been there at all, but I followed it anyway as it wound through dense pine forest. After about 20 miles, the trees thinned and I saw it spread out below me in the valley, not Ravenswood, but Lake Hollister, its dark waters gleaming in the morning light. The government had built an observation deck on the hillside where visitors could look out over the reservoir. I parked and walked to the railing. A bronze plaque mounted there read, Lake Hollister, Est, 2010, providing clean hydroelectric power and water to 3 counties. Beneath these waters once stood the town of Ravenswood, 1851-2009. No mention of Johannes Raven's doomed first settlement. No mention of the people who had vanished before the flooding. I was alone at the observation point, except for an older man fishing from a small pier that extended into the lake. He wore a heavy jacket despite the mild spring weather and kept his back to me as I approached. "Excuse me," I called out. "Is this a good fishing spot?" The man turned slowly. He had a weathered face and eyes so pale they were almost colorless. "Depends what you're fishing for," he said with a slight smile. "Some things beneath these waters are best left uncaught." "I'm looking for information actually," I said. "About ravens. Information's more dangerous than fish." He reeled in his line. There was nothing on the hook. "You must be Alex Coleman." I took an involuntary step back. "How do you know my name?" "I'm Theodore Werner. You've been reading my book." My mouth went dry. "Theodore Werner died 15 years ago." The man's smile widened, showing too many teeth. "Did I?" News travels slowly beneath the water. He gestured to the empty space next to him on the pier. "Sit, ask your questions, but remember, knowledge has a price in these parts." Against my better judgment, I said, "Are you DeepDiver83? One of my many names. What happened to Ravenswood?" The real story. Werner, or whoever he was, cast his line back into the water. The same thing that always happens when humans build on sacred ground. They take what isn't theirs and eventually payment comes due. The mine collapse wasn't an accident. Very good. He nodded approvingly. The veins of copper that made Ravenswood prosperous weren't natural formations. They were more like blood vessels of something much larger, something ancient. Werner's book mentioned the waiting one. "Ah, so you got to that part." He chuckled. "Names have power, you know. The waiting one is what the miners called it, because that's all they understood, that it was wait. But what they didn't ask was waiting for what?" A chill ran down my spine despite the afternoon sun. What was it waiting for? For someone who could carry the waters. Werner turned those pale eyes on me. "For you, Alex Coleman." "Me? Why?" "Because you were born with the mark." He pointed to the birthmark on my left wrist, a pale blue splotch in the rough shape of a crescent moon. In the old days, they would have recognized it immediately. They would have prepared you for your purpose. I covered my birthmark with my hand. "I don't have a purpose. Everyone born in Ravenswood had a purpose. The town existed because of the bargain. Johannes Raven promised his firstborn would serve as vessel. When he tried to flee instead, the entity took his entire settlement as compensation. The town that was rebuilt later, your Ravenswood, existed on borrowed time. What does this have to do with my mother? With all the people who disappeared?" Werner's expression softened slightly. "Your mother knew what you were. She tried to protect you. When the entity realized you'd escaped, it took substitutes. It took everyone connected to you by blood or bond, but substitutes are never sufficient. The hunger grows. This is insane, I said, standing up. You're saying some water monster ate my mother because it couldn't get to me. But, not ate, transformed. They're still there beneath the surface, neither living nor dead, waiting, just like the Ancient One waits. He reeled in his line again. This time something dark and squirming was attached to the hook. He removed it carefully and placed it in a bucket by his feet. I couldn't see what it was. If you don't believe me, he continued, go see for yourself. Wade into the shallows at sunset. Look into the waters when they turn clear. You'll see the truth. And if I don't... Werner's face hardened. The calls will continue. The messages, the dreams, they'll drive you mad eventually, or they'll spread to others, people you care about. The entity is patient, but its patience has limits. He stood and picked up his bucket. Whatever was inside made soft slapping sounds against the metal. One last piece of free advice, he said as he walked away. Don't trust what you see in Ravenswood. The town you remember doesn't exist anymore. What remains is just a reflection, beautiful but deadly. Wait, I called after him. How do I stop this? He paused but didn't turn around. You can't stop it. You can only complete the cycle that began before you were born. Go to the town hall at midnight. They're expecting you.
As Werner's truck disappeared round a bend, I turned back toward the lake. The sun was beginning its descent, casting long shadows across the water. According to Werner, or whatever he was, I would see the truth at sunset. Part of me wanted to get in my car and drive away, back to Chicago, back to my normal life. But I knew the calls would follow me, the messages, the dreams. I checked my phone. No signal, of course. The observation deck had a series of switchback trails leading down to the shore. I followed them, my footsteps crunching on gravel. Birds called from the surrounding forest, their songs oddly muted, as if coming through water. At the bottom, a small pebbly beach curved around a shallow cove. No swimming signs were posted every few yards. The standard warnings about underwater hazards and unpredictable currents. Now I wondered if they had a different purpose. I found a flat rock near the water's edge and sat down to wait for sunset. As the light faded, the lake's surface turned from blue to purple to a deep, bloody red. The water grew preternaturally still until it resembled a mirror, perfectly reflecting the darkening sky. Just as the last sliver of sun disappeared behind the western hills, something changed. The water became transparent, like perfectly clear glass. I gasped as I found myself looking down into an underwater world. 15 feet below the surface, I could see Main Street of Ravenswood stretching away from the shore. The buildings stood intact. The hardware store, the diner, the movie theater. Street lamps glowed with an eerie blue phosphorescence, and there were people moving slowly along the sidewalks, sitting in cars, standing in doorways. Their movements were languid, dreamlike. I leaned closer, my heart pounding. Outside the diner, a woman stood as if waiting for someone. She wore a blue dress that floated around her like a cloud. When she turned, I recognized my mother's face. "Mom," I whispered. She looked up, directly at me. Her lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear. Then she raised her hand and pointed urgently toward the town hall at the far end of Main Street. Other figures were noticing me now. They drifted toward the shore, their faces turning upward. Some looked confused, others desperate. A few smiled, in a way that made my skin crawl. Too wide, too eager. Among them was Tommy, my childhood friend. He pushed through the underwater crowd, his movements more purposeful than the other. He reached the edge of where the shore would have been, and pressed his hands against an invisible barrier. His face contorted with effort as he tried to break through. I scrambled backward as the water directly in front of Tommy began to bulge upward, forming a dome that rose slowly from the lake's surface. It stretched like a membrane, then broke with a sound like tearing silk. A geyser of water shot upward, then collapsed back into the lake. Tommy stood on the shore, dripping wet but somehow dry at the same time. His clothes, the same ones he'd been wearing the day of the mine collapse, showed no signs of waterlogging. His skin was pale but otherwise normal. "Alex," he said, his voice exactly as I remembered it. "You came back." I couldn't speak. Tommy had died 15 years ago. I'd attended his funeral, closed casket of course, after they'd recovered his body from the mine. I know this is a lot to take in, he continued, taking a step toward me, but we don't have much time. The pathway only opens at sunset, and only for a few minutes. You're not real, I managed to say. You're dead. Tommy grimaced. Dead. Alive. Those words don't mean much in Ravenswood anymore. He gestured toward the transparent lake. We exist in between, have for 15 years, ever since you left us. I didn't leave you, I protested. I tried to save you. I went for help, and never came back. There was no accusation in his voice, just a profound sadness. You were supposed to return, Alex. You were supposed to complete the cycle. What cycle? What are you talking about? Tommy looked over his shoulder. The water was beginning to lose its transparency, the submerged town growing dim. We don't have time for explanations. Not here. You need to come with me now. Into the lake. You're insane. Not into the lake. Into Ravenswood. He held out his hand. It's the only way you'll ever understand what happened. The only way you'll ever find peace. I stared at his outstretched hand. It looked solid, real. If I go with you, can I come back? Tommy hesitated. If you choose to. And if I don't, then the calls will continue. The dreams, the messages, they'll get worse. They'll spread to people you care about. Your girlfriend, Mia, your boss, Richard, your neighbor's little girl who reminds you of your sister. My blood ran cold. I'd never mentioned Mia to anyone in Ravenswood. She'd come into my life years after the town was gone. And how did he know about my neighbor's daughter? How? The waters connect everything, Alex. Past and present, what was and what will be. Tommy's expression grew urgent. Please, we have less than a minute before the pathway closes. Behind him, the submerged town was fading from view. The figures were growing dim, like images on an old television losing reception. My mother's face, looking up at me from the underwater street, was the last thing I could make out clearly. I thought of Werner's warning, don't trust what you see in Ravenswood, but I also thought of his certainty that the calls would continue, would spread to others. I reached out and took Tommy's hand. His grip was ice cold but solid. He smiled, a genuine smile that brought back a flood of childhood memories. Building forts in the woods, stealing apples from Old Man Guthrie's orchard, telling ghost stories with flashlights under blankets. Close your eyes, he said softly, and don't let go. I closed my eye. The world seemed to tilt beneath my feet. I felt a rushing sensation, like falling in a dream. The air around me turned thick, resistant. Then came a sensation of breaking through a barrier, like pushing through a membrane. When I opened my eyes, we were standing on Main Street in Ravenswood. The town was exactly as I remembered it, down to the peeling paint on the movie theater marquee, and the crack in the sidewalk outside the post office. But everything was bathed in a strange, bluish light, and all sounds seemed muffled, distant. Welcome home, Tommy said. I turned in a slow circle, taking in the impossible scene. People walked along the sidewalks, entered and exited shops, sat in cars at the lone traffic light. They moved normally, but there was something off about them, something I couldn't quite identify. How is this possible? We're underwater. Lake Hollister exists in your world, Tommy finished for me. Here Ravenswood never flooded. Here time stopped the day you left. My world, I echoed. What do you mean, my world? Tommy gestured toward the town hall down the street. Let's walk. I'll explain what I can. As we walked, I noticed the people around us were watching me. Some nodded in greeting. Others quickly looked away when our eyes met. A few made strange warding gestures with their hands. When the mine collapsed, Tommy said, it didn't just destabilize the town. It broke through to somewhere else. Somewhere old. The entity that lived there, what the miners called the Waiting One, had been contained for centuries by natural barriers. When those barriers broke, it began to spread, like a disease. Tommy considered this more like a transformation. It changes whatever it touches, water to not water, life to not life. It exists in the spaces between states of being. That doesn't make any sense. It doesn't have to make sense. It just is. He pointed to a puddle on the street. Unlike everything else, which seemed solid despite the blue lighting, the puddle moved strangely, its surface rippling in complex patterns. The entity's influence is everywhere here, in the water, in the air we breathe, in us. Are you saying you're infected? Tommy laughed. A hollow sound. Infected implies disease. We're not sick, Alex. We're changed, evolved. In a way, we don't age, we don't hunger, we exist in perfect equilibrium with our environment. Some would call it paradise. Then why do you need me? Why the phone calls?
The messages, his expression grew serious. Because paradise has a price, the entity requires balance. It gave us this existence. But something was missing. Someone was missing. We had reached the town square. In the center stood a bronze statue of the town's founder Johannes Ray. I'd passed it 1,000 times growing up. But now I noticed details I'd never seen before. The strange symbols etched into the base. The way Raven's outstretched hand was positioned as if holding something that wasn't there. The bargain was made long before any of us were born. Tommy continued. Raven promised the entity a vessel. Someone who could exist in both worlds. Who could carry the waters. In each generation one child is born with the mark. He gestured to my birthmark. You were chosen before you were born, Alex. Your mother knew. She tried to protect you. I remembered my mother's insistence that I never swim in Crawford Creek. Her panic when I'd fallen into the lake during a fishing trip with my father. The way she'd made me wear long sleeves even in summer covering my birthmark. The collapse happened because you left. Tommy's. The entity was trying to keep you here. To force you to fulfill your purpose. When that failed, it took substitutes, everyone connected to you. Your mother, your friends, half the town. That's why they disappeared, I whispered. Not because they were caught in the collapse. Tommy nodded grimly. They were taken, transformed. But it wasn't enough. Substitutes never are. The hunger has been growing for 15 years, and now it's reaching beyond Ravenswood. The calls, the messages, just the beginning. The entity is patient, but its patience has limit. It wants what was promised to it. It wants you, Alex. We had reached the town hall steps. The building loomed above us, its clock tower showing 3:17, just as it had in my dreams. What happens if I refuse? I asked. If I find a way back to my world and never return? Tommy's face darkened. Then the entity will continue to reach outward. The calls will become more frequent, the dreams more vivid. Eventually it will touch the minds of everyone you care about. Your girlfriend will dream of drowning every night until she walks into a lake. Your boss will hear whispers from every drain and faucet. The little girl next door will see faces in puddles, beckoning her closer. That's insane. That's the price of breaking the bargain. Tommy placed his hand on my shoulder. But there's another option. You can fulfill your purpose. You can become the vessel. You can save everyone. By doing what? By joining with the entity. By becoming what you were always meant to be. And what's that? Tommy's eyes seemed to darken, the pupils expanding until they were completely black. The new waiting one. I pulled away from. You're asking me to surrender my life, my identity. I'm asking you to transcend them. Tommy's voice had changed, becoming deeper, resonant, to become something greater than human, to achieve perfect equilibrium, to exist in all states simultaneously. And if I agree, what happens to everyone here? To my mother? They go free, the cycle ends, their souls move on to whatever comes next. And if I refuse, then you wake up on the shore of Lake Hollister. You live your life, and everyone you left behind remains as they are. Not alive, not dead, in between, until the hunger grows too great, and the entity reaches beyond these waters to claim new vessels. It wasn't really a choice at all, but I needed to know more before I decided. I want to see my mother, I said. Tommy nodded. She's waiting for you inside. Part 5. The Truth Beneath. The town hall's interior was as I remembered it. Marble floors, wooden benches, the smell of old paper and furniture polish. But like everything in this version of Ravenswood, it was bathed in that strange bluish light. My mother stood by the reception desk. She wore the same clothes she'd had on the day she disappeared. Jeans, a green sweater, sensible shoes. Her hair was pulled back in the practical ponytail she'd always favored. She looked exactly the same. Not a day older. Alex, she said, her voice breaking. My boy. I crossed the room and embraced her. She felt solid, real. She smelled like the lavender soap she'd always used, but her skin was cold, too cold. Mom, I whispered. What happened to you? She pulled back, touching my face with trembling fingers. I tried to protect you. I thought if I offered myself instead it would be enough. Offered yourself? Mom, what are you talking about? She glanced at Tommy, who nodded encouragingly. Show him, he said. My mother took a deep breath. Follow me. She led me through the town hall to a door I'd never noticed in all my years growing up in Ravenswood. It was small, almost hidden behind a large filing cabinet, with an ornate brass knob shaped like a curl of water. This door has always been here, she said, answering my unspoken question. Most people couldn't see it, only those who were part of the bargain. She turned the knob, and the door swung open. revealing a spiral staircase descending into darkness. A cold, damp air wafted up from below. These stairs lead to the old mine tunnels, my mother explained. The ones that were here before the mining company, before the town. The original settlers found them and thought they were natural formations. They weren't. I peered down into the darkness. What were they? Pathways, Tommy said from behind me, created by the entity long before humans arrived. They connect to similar tunnels all over the world, places where the veil between worlds is thin. My mother took a small blue stone from her pocket. It glowed with an inner light, illuminating the staircase. Take this, she said, pressing it into my palm. You'll need it below. The stone was warm despite my mother's cold touch. It pulsed gently, like a heartbeat. What is it? I asked. A piece of the entity, Tommy answered, or rather a piece of someone who joined with it long ago. It will guide you and protect you. I closed my fingers around the stone. Protect me from what? From the others, my mother said cryptically. Not everyone who became part of Ravenswood accepted their fate willingly. Some changed in ways we didn't expect. You don't have to do this, I told her. We can find another way. She smiled sadly. There is no other way, Alex. This was always your path. I just tried to delay it. She hugged me once more, then stepped back. Go now. Follow the stairs to the bottom. The entity will find you there. Aren't you coming with me? She shook her head. I can't. Only you can go the final distance. Only you can complete the cycle. Tommy placed his hand on my shoulder. I'll go with you as far as I can. I looked back at my mother, memorizing her face. If I do this, if I become what you're asking me to become, will I ever see you again? Not as I am now, she said softly, but perhaps someday, somewhere, in some form. The waters connect all things. Alex, remember that. She stepped back and closed the door behind us, leaving Tommy and me in the spiral staircase, illuminated only by the blue stone in my hand. Ready? Tommy asked. I wasn't, but I nodded anyway. We descended for what felt like hours. The stairs seemed endless, corkscrewing down into the earth. The air grew colder, damper. The walls, initially finished stone, gradually gave way to rough-hewn rock, then to what looked like natural cave formations. How much further? I asked at one point. Distance doesn't work the same way down here, Tommy replied. We're not just going down, we're going elsewhere. Finally, the stairs ended in a large cavern. The ceiling soared above us, stalactites hanging like stone teeth. The floor was smooth, polished by centuries of flowing water. In the center of the cavern was a pool of water so black it seemed to absorb the light from my stone. This is as far as I go, Tommy said. The pool is the threshold. Beyond it lies the entity. I approached the pool cautiously. The water's surface was perfectly still, like black glass. Looking into it was like looking into an abyss. What do I do? I asked. You enter the pool, Tommy said. You let the waters take you. I hesitated. Will it hurt? Tommy's face softened. Death hurts. Transformation is different, a release in many ways. So I will die. The person you are now will cease to exist, but what you become will be greater than anything you can imagine. I looked down at the stone in my hand, then back at the pool. You said this would protect me. From what? Tommy shifted uncomfortably. From those who were transformed unwillingly. Some retain a hunger. They resent what they've become. They might try to prevent you from completing the cycle. By doing what? By trying to take your place. Only one can be the vessel, Alex. The others, they're like echoes, fragments. They want to be whole again. A splash from the pool drew my attention. The surface rippled, though there was no wind, no movement to disturb it. Then slowly, something began to rise from the center. It was a hand, a human hand, pale and waterlogged. Then an arm, a shoulder. A figure emerged from the pool, water cascading from its body. It wore the tattered remains of what might once have been a suit. Its face was half rotted, one eye gone, leaving an empty socket. Johannes Raven, Tommy whispered. The first vessel. Raven's remaining eye fixed on me. His mouth opened, revealing blackened teeth. You, he said, his voice a wet, gurgling sound. You are the one who was promised. I took an involuntary step back. I never promised anything. The mark, Raven hissed, pointing at my birthmark. You were born with the mark, born to serve. I was born to live my own life, I replied, not to be some sacrifice for a bargain I never made. Raven laughed, a horrible sound, like water being forced through a blocked pipe. Your life is nothing. A spark, A moment. What awaits you is eternity. As a rotting corpse like you. His eye narrowed. This form is temporary, a vessel outworn. What I become when I return to the depths, that is beyond your comprehension. Then show me. I challenged. Show me what I'm supposed to become. Raven smiled, stretching his decayed lips. With pleasure, he began to change. His form shimmered, like heat waves rising from hot pavement. His rotting flesh flowed like wax, restructuring itself. His missing eye regrew. His skin smoothed and tightened. Within moments he stood before me as a handsome young man in period clothing. The Johannes Raven who had first led settlers to this valley 2 centuries ago. This is what you could be, he said, his voice now rich and resonant, ageless, formless, able to be anything, anyone. And what's the price? I asked. Surrender. Raven replied simply. Surrender your identity, your individuality, become one with the waters, with the entity. And if I refuse? Raven's handsome face twisted into something ugly. Then the hunger will grow, the reaching will continue. Everyone you love will be drawn into the depths, one by one, and you will watch, helpless, as they change. I looked at Tommy, who stood silent watching. Is he telling the truth? Tommy's expression was pained. Yes, the entity cannot be denied what was promised to it. If not you, then many others. I turned back to Raven. And if I agree, if I become whatever it is you want me to become, what happens to everyone else? To my mother? To Tommy? To all the people of Ravenswood? They go free, Raven said. Their souls move on to whatever comes next. Their purpose will be fulfilled. And Ravenswood, the town, remains as it is, a nexus point, a place between worlds, but it will no longer reach beyond its boundaries. The cycle will be complete. I thought of my life in Chicago, my job, my apartment, my girlfriend, me. I thought of all the things I had yet to experience, the places I had yet to see. Was I really willing to give all that up? But then I thought of my mother, trapped in this half-life for 15 years because of me, of Tommy, my best friend, who died because of all the people of Ravenswood, caught in a limbo not of their making. If I do this, I said slowly, I want your word that everyone goes free, not just the people of Ravenswood, but anyone the entity has touched, anyone who's received calls, messages, dreams, everyone. Raven's eyes narrowed. That is not within my power to promise. Then I'm not interested, Raven hissed, his handsome face momentarily slipping to reveal the rotting visage beneath. You dare to bargain? I'm not bargaining, I'm setting terms. I stepped closer to the pool, closer to him. If I'm really what you say I am, if I'm really the chosen vessel, then I have power here. I have a choice. Raven and Tommy exchanged glances. Something unspoken passed between them. Very well, Raven said eventually. All souls touched by the entity will be released. But know this. Once you enter the waters, once you begin the transformation, there is no turning back. What you become will no longer be human. I nodded. I understand. I turned to Tommy. Will you tell my mother goodbye for me? And if there's a way, could you get a message to me? Tell her I'm sorry, and that I wish things could have been different. Tommy nodded, his eyes shining with unshed tears. I'll find a way. I took a deep breath and approached the edge of the pool. The black water seemed to pulse with an inner life, as if it were breathing. I thought I saw shapes moving beneath the surface. Faces, hands, indistinct forms. What do I do? I asked. Into the water, Raven instructed. Let yourself sink to the bottom. The entity will find you there. I took off my shoes and jacket, leaving them on the edge of the pool. The blue stone in my hand pulsed more rapidly, as if sensing what was about to happen. I clutched it tightly, and stepped into the water. It was cold, colder than any water I'd ever felt. It seemed to pull at me, eager to draw me deeper. I waded in up to my knees. Then the water clung to me strangely, almost like a living thing. When I was chest deep, I looked back at Tommy one last time. Goodbye, old friend. Tommy raised his hand in farewell. Goodbye, Alex, and thank you. I took a deep breath and dove beneath the surface. The water closed over my head, and immediately I felt a change. The cold vanished, replaced by a strange, neutral temperature that was neither warm nor cool. The darkness wasn't total. A faint blue glow emanated from the stone in my hand, illuminating the water around. I let myself sink, down and down. The pool was far deeper than it had appeared from the surface. As I descended, I saw things in the water, flitting shapes, momentary glimpses of faces, hands reaching out, only to dissolve into darkness. My lungs began to burn, but I kept sinking. Just when I thought I couldn't hold my breath any longer, something shifted. The burning sensation stopped. I realized with shock that I was breathing not air, but water. It filled my lungs without drowning me. A strange, alien sensation. I continued to sink until I reached the bottom of the pool, except it wasn't a bottom in the conventional sense. It was more like a threshold, a boundary between states. Below me, I could see something, a vast, amorphous presence that seemed to stretch infinitely in all directions. It was like looking at the night sky, but instead of stars, there were countless points of blue-white light moving in complex patterns. As I watched, the lights began to coalesce, forming a rough approximation of a human face, large enough to fill my entire field of vision. Alex Coleman. A voice resonated in my mind. The promised one. The vessel. Who are you? I tried to speak, but no sound came out. Instead, my thoughts projected outward. I am what your kind has called many things. The waiting one. The deep dweller. The water bearer. I am old. Older than your species. Older than this land. What do you want from me? What was promised? A vessel, a bridge between worlds, a being who can carry the waters. Why me? Because you were born with the mark, because your bloodline traces back to Johannes Raven, who made the first bargain, because you have the capacity to become more than human. And if I agree, what happens to everyone else? They go free as promised. Their souls move on to whatever comes next. The cycle ends. And what do I become? Instead of answering, the entity showed me. Images flooded my mind of what I would be, what I would experience, what I would know. It was overwhelming, beyond human comprehension. I would be everywhere water existed, from the deepest oceans to the highest cloud. I would experience time differently, seeing past, present, and future simultaneously. I would know the thoughts of every creature that drank, every plant that absorbed moisture through its roots. It was beautiful and terrifying. I would be everything and nothing, everywhere and nowhere. This is what awaits you, the entity said. This is what you were born for. I thought of my mother, trapped in this half-life, for 15 years, of Tommy, my best friend, who died because I ran, of all the people of Ravenswood, caught in a limbo, not of their making. I agree. I projected. I'll become your vessel, but you must keep your promise. Everyone goes free. Spoken and witnessed. The bargain is made. The face dissolved into countless points of light again. They began to move toward me, surrounding me, entering through my skin, my eyes, my mouth. I felt myself changing, expanding beyond the confines of my body. My consciousness stretched outward, touching every drop of water in the cavern, then beyond to the lake above, to the rivers that fed it, to the rain clouds, forming miles away. I was no longer Alex Coleman. I was the water. I was the entity. I was both, and neither. As my transformation completed, I felt to mold the souls of Ravenswood, held in suspension for 15 years. I felt their relief, as they were released, moving on to whatever came next. My mother's soul brushed against mine, as it passed, a moment of connection, of love and gratitude, and sorrow. Then they were gone, and I was alone with the entity, or rather I was the entity, the waiting one, the new vessel. The cycle was complete. Epilogue. The ripple.
I don't know how long I existed in that state of pure being. Time has no meaning when you experience all moments simultaneously. But gradually I became aware of myself again, of Alex Coleman, of the human I had been. Not gone, but transformed, expanded. I learned to focus my consciousness, to experience the world through water. I could be in many places at once, in the lake that had once been Ravenswood, in the rain falling on Chicago, in the morning dew on grass, hundreds of miles away. I watched as life returned to normal in the places the entity had touched. The mysterious calls stopped. The dreams faded. People who had been haunted by visions of water and drowned towns found peace. I watched Mia move on with her life. Tommy had found a way to get my message to her, a letter apparently written by me before my hiking accident at Lake Hollister. She mourned, but eventually found happiness with someone else. I was glad. I watched as Lake Hollister became just another reservoir, its waters clear and clean. The submerged town of Ravenswood was gone, truly gone this time. Its buildings crumbled to dust, its streets reclaimed by nature. The souls that had been trapped there had moved on. The cycle had ended. But I remained, the waiting one, the vessel, the bridge between worlds. I learned that I was not the first, nor would I be the last. Johannes Raven had been the first vessel, but he had tried to escape his fate, causing the entity to take his entire settlement in retribution. Others had come after him, willing or unwilling sacrifices to maintain the balance. I learned that the entity was not malevolent, not really. It was ancient, with a perspective and morality alien to human understanding. It had been part of this world long before humans evolved, and would remain long after they were gone. It had made bargains with humans, not out of cruelty, but out of a strange sense of symbiosis. It gave prosperity, life, abundance. In return, it required a vessel, a consciousness that could bridge the gap between its reality and ours. I don't know if I made the right choice. Sometimes, in the quiet moments, when I'm most aware of my former humanity, I miss the simple pleasures of being Alex Coleman, the taste of coffee in the morning, the feeling of sun on my skin, the sound of Mia's laughter. But then I expand my consciousness, feel myself flowing through rivers and oceans, rising as mist, falling as rain. And I know that I've become something greater than I ever could have been, as a mere human. Still, I watch over those I loved. I make sure the balance is maintained. I ensure that the hunger that once drove the entity to reach beyond its boundaries remains satisfied. And sometimes, on quiet nights, when the moon is full and the water is still, I gather enough of myself to form a human shape. I walk along the shore of Lake Hollister, leaving wet footprints that evaporate behind me. I look up at the stars and remember what it was like to be bound by flesh and bone, to be limited to one place, one time. It's on one of these nights that I see her, a young woman standing at the observation deck, looking out over the water. She has a birthmark on her wrist, a pale blue crescent moon. She's drawn to this place without knowing why, feeling a connection she can't explain. I could reach out to her, I could call to her, send her dreams, draw her into the cycle again. Part of me, the part that was once the entity, hungers for this. A vessel born of my bloodline would be powerful indeed, but I resist. I've learned what the entity never could, the value of choice, of free will. I'll watch over her, protect her from the hunger that always lurks beneath the surface. I'll make sure she lives her life fully, freely, without the burden of ancient bargains, because that's what the entity never understood, what Johannes Raven and all the others never grasped. The true power of water isn't in its ability to drown, to consume, to transform. It's in its ability to sustain life, to nourish, to cleanse. And so I remain, the waiting one, the vessel, the guardian of the waters, neither human nor entity, but something in between, a bridge between worlds, maintaining the balance, ensuring the cycle remains complete. If you're reading this account, know that it was written by what remains of Alex Coleman, fragments of consciousness, gathered together, memories preserved in the flow of water. I've left these words as a warning, a confession, a testament. Be careful of still waters, be wary of lakes, where towns once stood. Listen for the sound of bells beneath the surface, for voices calling from disconnected numbers. And if you ever find yourself near Lake Hollister at sunset, when the water turns clear as glass and you can see something moving in the depths, walk away. Don't look back. Don't answer if it calls your name, because I am watching, I am waiting. And while I try to be benevolent, to remember my humanity, there is always the hunger, the need for connection, the desire for another vessel, to share this vast, lonely existence. The water remembers, the water waits, and sometimes, in the darkness of the deep, so do. But perhaps, somewhere beneath the surface of a lake or river near you, another story is just beginning. They found Eliza Reed's body 3 days after the broadcast. She was sitting upright in her living room chair, eyes fixed on the television screen, which displayed nothing but static. The coroner ruled it natural causes, heart failure, though her expression suggested anything but peace. Her mouth was frozen in a silent scream, eyes wide with what could only be described as absolute terror. The strange part? The TV wasn't even plugged in. I wouldn't have known about Eliza if she hadn't been my neighbor. We weren't close, just casual hellos when collecting mail, but her death struck me as odd, especially since she was the third person in our apartment building to die the same way in 2 months. All 3 victims found in front of unplugged televisions, all 3 with expressions of horror, all 3 with no signs of struggle or foul play. When the police dismissed it as coincidence, I started digging on my own. I should have left it alone. My name is Morgan Chen. I'm a sound engineer at WKRP, our local radio station. I spend my days adjusting levels, cleaning up audio, making sure our broadcasts go out crystal clear. I understand frequencies, waveforms, the science of sound. What I found defies that understanding. It started with rumors from the night shift, people calling in to report strange broadcasts, interrupting regular programming. A few seconds of static, followed by whispered words. They couldn't quite make out. Our program director chalked it up to signal interference, maybe some pirate radio operation. Then I heard it myself. I was working late, monitoring a pre-recorded interview with the mayor. When the audio cut out, static filled my headphones, not random white noise, but rhythmic pulsing, almost like breathing. Then came the whispers, so faint I had to turn up the volume to maximum. "We see you watching." The voice was dry, raspy, like someone who hadn't spoken in years. It repeated the phrase 3 times before the static faded and the interview resumed as if nothing had happened. I checked the recording immediately. There was no interruption, no static, no whisper. The interview played perfectly from beginning to end. Had I hallucinated it? I'd been working 16-hour shifts that week, running on caffeine and determination. Exhaustion plays tricks on the mind. But the next night, it happened again. Different program, same interruption, static, then whispers. The screen is a window, we can look in. I wasn't alone this time. My colleague Darius heard it too. We both rushed to check the equipment, thinking we'd found the source of the mysterious broadcasts our listeners had reported. But like before, the recording showed no interruption. "Maybe it's not in our system," Darius suggested. "Maybe it's happening between us and the transmitter." We ran diagnostics, checked every piece of equipment. Nothing seemed amiss. But when I analyzed the audio spectrum during our next broadcast, I found something strange. A subsonic frequency riding beneath our normal signal, too low for human ears to detect consciously, but present nonetheless, under 10 hertz, just at the edge of human perception. The frequency appeared regularly, always for 17 seconds, always followed by 3 minutes and 42 seconds of normal broadcasting before repeating. The pattern was too precise to be accidental. I took the data home, converted the subsonic frequency to an audible range, and listened. The static was clearer now, structured almost like language. Beneath it, barely perceptible, were voices, hundreds of them whispering in unison. I couldn't make out individual words, but the cadence was unmistakably speech. That night, my television turned itself on. I'd been at my computer, headphones on, when movement caught my eye. The screen flickered to life, showing only static, gray and white pixels dancing, forming patterns that almost resembled faces before dissolving. I approached cautiously, reaching for the power button. Before I could touch it, the static shifted. A dark shape moved within it, like someone stepping toward a fogged window. A hand pressed against the screen from the inside. I stumbled backward, knocking over my chair. The hand, gray and distorted but unmistakably human, flattened against the glass, as if testing its strength. Then another appeared, and another, dozens of hands pushing against the screen from within the static. I ran from the apartment, spent the night in my car. When I returned in the morning, the TV was off. I unplugged it anyway, wrapped the cord around the set, and shoved it in a closet. At work,
I pulled Darius aside and showed him my findings about the subsonic frequency. It's not random, I explained. It's a code of some kind, and I think it's affecting our electronics. Darius looked skeptical. You're saying this mystery signal is haunting TVs. I'm saying there's a connection between these broadcasts and what happened to the people in my building. I told him about my neighbors, about their deaths in front of unplugged televisions. That's messed up, he admitted, but correlation isn't causation. Morgan, maybe check your carbon monoxide detector. He was right to be skeptical. I would have been too if I hadn't seen those hands. I spent the next week researching similar phenomena. Reports were scattered but consistent. Mysterious broadcasts, electronic devices activating independently, people experiencing lost time while watching stat. Most disturbing were the deaths, always following the same pattern. Victim found before a television. Expression of terror. No obvious cause of death. The cases dated back to the 1950s, when television first became commonplace in American homes. They spiked during transitions to new broadcast technologies, the shift to color, to cable, to digital. One name kept appearing in research papers about these incidents: Dr. Eleanor West, a physicist who'd specialized in broadcast technologies before her career ended abruptly in her final paper, never formally published but circulated in certain academic circles, proposed a radical theory that the electromagnetic spectrum contained thin places frequencies where our reality brushed against another. According to West, these frequencies weren't just channels for transmitting information, they were gateways, and sometimes things came through. Most disturbing was her final note: they are aware of us now. They are watching through the static. Dr. West disappeared 3 days after submitting her paper. Police found her home office in disarray, her television tuned to static, a single handprint visible on the screen, not pressed against the outside of the glass, but visible beneath it, as if someone had reached through from inside the TV and pulled her in. I needed to talk to someone who understood this phenomenon better than I did. My research led me to Oliver Kane, a former colleague of Dr. West, who now lived as a recluse in a cabin outside town. No phone, no internet, no electronic devices of any kind. According to local rumor, finding him wasn't easy. His property was unmarked, accessible only by a narrow dirt road. Signs warned trespassers to turn back. I ignored them. The cabin was smaller than I expected, little more than a shack surrounded by a perimeter of salt, not scattered, but carefully arranged in an unbroken line. Protection, I realized. Kane answered my knock with a shotgun in hand. He was older than I'd expected, late 70s at least, with wild white hair and skin deeply tanned from outdoor living. No reporters, he growled. I'm not a reporter, I said quickly. I work at WKRP. I've been tracking a strange frequency in our broadcasts. His expression shifted from hostility to alarm. 110. My heart jumped. Yes, how did you? Inside, he ordered, stepping back. Don't break the salt line. Kane's cabin was dimly lit by oil lamps. No electricity, as rumored. The walls were covered with equations, diagrams of waveforms, and old newspaper clippings about mysterious deaths. A map of the United States displayed dozens of red pins, each marking what I assumed was an incident. You've heard them, haven't you? Kane asked, setting his shotgun aside. The voices in the static. I nodded, and I saw something, hands pressing against my television screen from the inside. Kane didn't seem surprised. They're getting bold. The transition to digital broadcasting gave them more bandwidth, more ways to cross over. He gestured to his research. Ellie, Dr. West. She was right about everything. There's another world pressed against ours, separated by nothing more than frequency. What are they? We called them frequencies, Kane replied. Entities composed of electromagnetic radiation rather than matter. They existed alongside us, unaware of our world just as we were unaware of theirs. Until television, until we started broadcasting signals that penetrated their realm. He showed me Dr. West's original notes, preserved in plastic sleeves. The static between channels, that's where the barrier is thinnest. They discovered they could see us through it, like looking through a window. Then they learned they could reach through, with effort. But what do they? Kane's expression darkened. To feed, they consume electrical energy, including the bioelectricity in our bodies. Your neighbors who died watching static, the frequencies reached through, touched them, and drained them. Heart failure is the medical explanation, but it's more accurate to say they were emptied. Why isn't this common knowledge? I demanded. Why isn't anyone warning people? Who would believe it? Monsters in the static. Kane shook his head. Those who discovered the truth either disappeared or were discredited. After Ellie vanished, I tried to continue her work, to warn people. I was labeled a conspiracy theorist, lost my position at the university. He showed me more documents, his own research, building on Dr. West's work. The frequency you found, 110.9 Hz, is what we called a thin broadcast. It weakens the barrier, makes it easier for them to reach through. How do we stop it? I asked. Kane's laugh was bitter. You don't. The best you can do is protect yourself. No electron salt lines. They can't cross them for some reason. Perhaps the mineral disrupts their energy pattern. There has to be a way to block the frequency, to strengthen the barrier. We tried, Kane said. Ellie developed a counter frequency, a broadcast that would seal the thin place, but before we could implement it, he trailed off. Before they took her, I finished. Kane nodded. I've spent decades trying to recreate her work. I'm close, but without her final calculations. He gestured helplessly. I thought about our radio station, broadcasting that subsonic frequency across the city. How many people were at risk? How many televisions might become windows or doors for these entities? I need to stop our broadcast, I said. It won't help, Kane warned. The frequency is already out there, spreading from device to device. They've been planning this for years, establishing a network. The recent deaths are just the beginning. Then give me what you have, I insisted. The counter frequency, even if it's incomplete. I can broadcast it. Buy us time to figure out the rest. Kane hesitated, then nodded. He dug through his papers, producing a flash drive, the only piece of technology I'd seen in his cabin. This contains everything, our research, the partial counter frequency. But be careful. Once they realize what you're doing, they'll come for me, I finished. Like they came for Ellie. I left Kane's cabin as darkness fell, the flash drive heavy in my pocket. The trip back to town seemed longer, shadows deep. Twice I thought I saw movement in the trees beside the road, tall, fluid shapes that moved like television static, given form. At home I found my closet door open, the TV I'd hidden now sitting in the center of my living room, plugged in and displaying static. I should have run. Instead, I approached it slowly, drawn by movement within the gray-white noise. A face was forming, features indistinct, but recognizable as human. A woman, her expression pleading. Dr. Eleanor West, reaching out from within the static. Her lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear. I moved closer, straining to understand. The static pulsed, synchronizing with my heartbeat. The room's temperature dropped sharply, my breath fogging in suddenly frigid air. The face pressed forward, the screen bulging outward, as if made of flexible material. West's features became clearer, eyes wide with terror, mouth open in a silent scream. Behind her, shadowy figures moved in the static, their forms flickering between humanoid and something alien, geometric. Her hand shot out, breaking through the screen, grasping my wrist. Her touch was electric, sending painful shocks up my arm. Her skin was cold, slick with something that looked like liquid static. Don't broadcast, she gasped, her voice distorted like badly tuned radio. Trap, it's a trap. The shadowy figures surged forward, pulling her back. She fought against them, her grip on my wrist tightening painfully. They want the station amplifies. Static overtook her words, her face dissolving into noise. With a final surge of strength, she pressed something into my palm, a small object that burned cold against my skin. Then she was gone, yanked back into the static, as the screen returned to normal. In my hand was a small data card, similar to the kind we used at the station for audio storage, but unlike any specific model I recognized. It was etched with a single symbol, a waveform I recognized from Kane's diagrams. The true counter frequency, I understood then. The flash drive Kane had given me was compromised. The partial counter frequency would have done exactly the opposite of what we needed, not sealing the barrier, but shattering it completely, allowing the frequencies unrestricted access to our world. Kane wasn't working against them, he was working for them. I needed to get to the station, to broadcast the real counter frequency, before it was too late. But when I tried to leave, my apartment door wouldn't open. The knob turned, but the door remained firmly shut as if sealed. My phone showed no signal. Water ran black from the faucet and from every electronic device. My laptop, my microwave, Even my electric toothbrush came the sound of static, growing louder by the minute. They knew what I had. They weren't going to let me leave. The TV flickered, displaying Kane's face, but not Kane as I'd met him younger. His expression cold and calculating. "You shouldn't have gone digging, Morgan," he said, his voice overlaid with static. "Some doors are meant to stay closed. You're one of them." I realized. His smile was terrible, not original, but they offered me something Eleanor refused. Transcendence, a new existence beyond the limitations of flesh. His image flickered, momentarily revealing something inhuman beneath the facade. I guided her research, ensured she found the thin place. When she discovered the truth about me, about what waited on the other side, she tried to seal the gateway, but you stopped her. We stopped her, he corrected, and we've been working ever since to widen the doorway. Your radio station is perfect. Old equipment, powerful transmitter, centrally located. Once we broadcast our frequency from there, every electronic device within range will become a gateway. Why? I demanded. Why do this? Because we're hungry, Kane replied simply. Your world is rich with energy, electrical, biological, an endless feast. His image dissolved into static, which began to take three-dimensional form, flowing out of the screen like thick smoke. It coalesced into a vaguely humanoid shape, taller than should have been possible in my apartment, its head brushing the ceiling. More static poured from other devices, forming similar figures. They surrounded me, their features constantly shifting, bodies humming with electrical energy that made my skin prickle. One reached for me, its arm elongating impossibly. I ducked, scrambling backward, until I hit the wall. The data card West had given me felt hot now, vibrating against my palm. Understanding came in a flash. The counter frequency wasn't just a broadcast, it was a weapon. I activated my phone's voice recorder and held the data card against its microphone. The screen glitched, then displayed a waveform I'd never seen before. Complex, fractal patterns that hurt my eyes to look at directly. When I pressed play, the sound that emerged wasn't audible to human ears, but its effect on the static figures was immediate. They recoiled, their forms destabilizing, chunks of static falling away like burning paper. The pressure holding the door shut released. I ran, phone still playing the counter frequency, keeping the static creatures at bay. The streets were chaos. Power lines sparked and swayed with no wind to move them. Every screen, store displays, smartphones, electronic billboards, showed static faces pressing against them from the inside. People stood frozen on sidewalks, staring at their devices, as ghostly hands reached out toward them. The radio station was 6 blocks away. I ran, the counter frequency creating a bubble of protection around me. Static figures formed from electronics I passed, reaching for me but unable to penetrate the barrier of sound.
The front desk was empty, the security guard's chair occupied only by a pile of clothes, as if the person wearing them had simply disappeared. The static hummed with electricity, making my hair stand on end. I made my way to the broadcasting booth, following the familiar path through darkened hallways. Emergency lights cast red glows through the static fog, creating shifting shadows that moved independently of any source. Whispers surrounded me, countless voices speaking just below the threshold of comprehension. The main studio was worse. Static entities filled the room, clustered around the broadcasting equipment. At the control panel sat what was once Darius. His body remained, but his eyes were blank screens displaying snow, his mouth open in a silent scream as static poured out like breath in cold air. In the center of it all stood Kane, or what appeared to be Kane. His form flickered between the elderly man I'd met and something else, tall, angular, composed of shifting patterns and frequencies. He was connecting a device to our main transmitter, a contraption of wires and unfamiliar components, the gateway generator. Morgan, he said without turning, just in time to witness history. In 2 minutes, we broadcast the opening frequency to every device within a 100-mile radius. What happened to Darius? I demanded, though I already knew. Kane gestured dismissively. Conversion, inefficient, but necessary for the initial phase. His bioelectrical pattern now serves a greater purpose. The static entities began to close in around me, My phone's battery was nearly dead, the counter frequency weakening. I needed to reach the main console to broadcast the true counter frequency before Kane could activate his device. They've been waiting centuries for this moment. Kane continued, your technology finally evolved enough to sustain them, to allow complete crossover. Billions of screens worldwide, billions of doorways. I lunged forward, ducking under a static figure's grasping arm. The counter frequency disrupted its form momentarily, buying me precious seconds. Kane turned, his human facade slipping further, revealing the entity beneath. Stop, he commanded, his voice distorting into multiple tones. Static tendrils shot from his fingertips, arcing toward me like electrical currents. I dove behind the sound booth, the tendrils striking equipment instead, melting plastic and metal on contact. My phone died with a final spark, leaving me defenseless. Kane approached slowly, savoring the moment. You have something that belongs to us, he said, Ellie's last gift. Give it to me, and I'll make your conversion painless. The data card burned in my palm, my last hope. I needed to get it into the broadcast system, but Kane stood between me and the controls. What happened to Dr. West? I asked, stalling for time. Is she still alive in there, in the static? In a manner of speaking, Kane replied, the static preserves consciousness, while consuming the energy that sustains it. A living battery, you might say. She's been powering our efforts for decades. I glanced around desperately for any advantage. My gaze fell on the emergency broadcast system, a separate, analog setup designed to function even during power failures. Old technology, predating digital. It might be my only chance. Kane must have read my intention in my expression. He lunged forward, static form, elongating impossibly. I rolled aside, scrambling toward the emergency system. His hand caught my ankle, sending painful shocks up my leg. I kicked free, the contact, leaving frost-like burns on my skin. With a final effort, I reached the emergency console, slammed the data card into its reader. Nothing happened. Analog system, Kane laughed, his voice crackling like lightning. That card needs digital integration. You've failed, Morgan. He was right. The emergency system couldn't read the card's digital format. I was out of options. Then I remembered my training. Sound could be converted, transmitted across different media. The frequency pattern was what mattered, not the delivery method. I grabbed the microphone, held the card close to my lips, and began to whistle the pattern I'd seen displayed on my phone. Not a perfect reproduction, but close enough. The mathematical sequence translated into sound waves. Kane screamed, his form destabilizing. The static entities around us vibrated, their shapes losing coherence. He lurched toward me, but too late. I had already activated the emergency broadcast, sending my whistled pattern out across all frequencies. The effect was immediate and catastrophic for them. The static entities collapsed, their forms dissipating like smoke and wind. Kane's human disguise melted away completely, revealing his true form, a writhing mass of electromagnetic patterns, struggling to maintain cohesion. This changes nothing, he hissed, his voice breaking apart. We've waited centuries, we'll wait centuries more. As long as your world broadcasts signals, we'll find a way through. His form contracted, pulled toward screens and electronic devices, as if by powerful magnet. Around me, all static entities were experiencing the same fate, forced back into the devices they'd emerged from. The last thing I saw was Kane's face, no longer human but still somehow expressing rage, as he was sucked back into the The screens throughout the station flickered and went dark. Silence fell, broken only by the sound of the emergency broadcast, my whistled pattern repeating on a loop across all frequencies. I collapsed into a chair, trembling from exhaustion and electrical burn. Darius lay unconscious but breathing, the static gone from his eyes and mouth. He would recover, though I doubted he'd remember what happened. When the authorities arrived, responding to the emergency broadcast, I told them there had been an electrical malfunction, a power surge that affected the studio. They believed me,
It was far more plausible than in the days that followed, I searched for information about any similar incidents nationwide. Reports filtered in of electronic devices failing simultaneously, of people experiencing lost time or hallucinations involving static, but no death, no disappearance. The counter-frequency had worked, at least temporarily. I resigned from WKRP the following week. I couldn't bear to be near broadcasting equipment, knowing what might be listening on the other side of the signal. Before leaving, I made copies of the data card, sending them anonymously to radio stations across the country with simple instructions. Broadcast this pattern for 5 minutes daily as a system test. Most would comply without question. Standard industry procedure includes regular test broadcasts, a defensive network creating a barrier frequency that would keep the static at bay. I moved to a small cabin in the mountains, far from cell service or internet. Like Cain before me, the real Cain, before he was replaced. I live without electronics, no screens, no speakers, nothing that could become a doorway, but sometimes, on still nights, I swear I can hear static in the air around me, a soft rhythmic hissing, like breathing, and words, just at the edge of hearing. We see you watching. They're still out there in the frequencies between stations, in the static between channels, waiting, hungry, patient. Turn off your devices tonight. Listen to the silence. Truly listen. And if you hear static where there should be none, run. Because they've seen you now, and the screen is only a window until they decide to make it a door. Addendum found on a handwritten note, attached to the original manuscript. 3 days after writing this account, I woke to find my cabin surrounded by static figures, dozens of them, standing just beyond the salt line I'd laid. They can't cross it, but they're learning. Testing. The salt grows weaker each day. Yesterday I found a television in my living room. I don't own a television. It wasn't plugged in, but the screen showed static anyway. A face is forming in it now. As I write these words, Dr. West. I think though her features are difficult to make out. She's trying to tell me something, but I refuse to move closer, to listen. The static grows louder each night. I don't know how much longer the salt will hold. I don't know if anyone will find this warning in time. If you're reading this, remember, they aren't confined to electronics anymore. They've found another way through. The frequency is inside us now. Our brainwaves, our bioelectricity, the perfect broadcast tower. They're already here. Can you hear the static?
The scratching started 3 nights ago, not the timid scrabble of mice in the walls, but deliberate, calculated, like fingernails testing the strength of wood. I told myself it was the old maple outside my bedroom window, branches scraping against the siding, but trees don't scratch in pattern. They don't pause, listening, before starting again. I should have left then, before I found the first hollow space. My name is Daniel Mercer, and I've always been drawn to old houses. There's something about their history, the lives that have unfolded within their walls, that fascinates me. So when I inherited my grandmother's Victorian home in Blackwood Falls, I was ecstatic. The house had been in our family for generations, passing down through the maternal line. My mother had refused to live there after she turned 18, though she never explained why. Some places just don't want certain people, she'd said once, her eyes distant. That house never wanted me. I dismissed her concerns as superstition. The house was a treasure, 3 stories of ornate woodwork, stained glass and hidden nooks. I'd spent summers there as a child, exploring its countless rooms and crawl spaces. When I moved in last month, it felt like coming home. The first week was perfect. I set up my office in the library, where morning light streamed through the tall window. I spent my days writing. I'm a novelist, specializing in historical fiction, and my evenings exploring rooms I'd forgotten existed. It wasn't until the second week that I noticed something odd. The measurements weren't adding up. I'd been mapping the house, partly out of curiosity, and partly as research for my next book. But when I compared the interior dimensions to the exterior, I found discrepancies, small ones at first, a few inches here and there, but they grew larger as I worked my way through the house. An entire section of the second floor seemed to be missing from the inside. I convinced myself it was just an error in my measurements. Old houses settled. Walls weren't always perfectly straight. Then I found the first hollow space. I was in the master bedroom, testing the wooden paneling that covered the walls. Most of it was solid, but one section about 3 feet wide sounded different when I knocked on it. Hollow. I searched for a mechanism, some hidden catch, but found nothing. That night, the scratching began. At first, I thought it was coming from inside the walls, but as I lay in bed, straining to hear, I realized it was coming from the other side of the paneling. Something was in that hollow space, scratching to get out. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. By the third night, exhaustion had made me reckless. I took a crowbar from the garage and pried at the paneling until it splintered. Behind it was a small, narrow corridor, just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. The air that rushed out was cold and stale, carrying a scent I couldn't identify, something old and vaguely metallic. I shone my flashlight into the darkness, revealing a passage that twisted away into shadow. I should have sealed it up. Instead, I stepped inside. The passage was longer than should have been possible, winding deep into space that couldn't exist within the house's dimensions. The walls were unfinished, raw wood that looked fresh despite the house's age. No dust, no cobwebs, just smooth, clean wood and carving, hundreds of them, etched into every surface, names, dates, and beneath each name, a tally mark. I recognized some of the names, ancestors, relatives I'd never met. The most recent was my grandmother's, etched in a shaky hand, 5 tally marks beneath it. I followed the passage until it opened into a small room. There was nothing inside, except a chair facing the wall, and a small table holding a knife and a candle. The wall in front of the chair was covered in a single repeated phrase, carved over and over, "Feed the hollow men." I backed out of the room, my heart pounding. When I returned to my bedroom, the paneling had sealed itself shut. No evidence remained of the damage I'd done, not even splinters on the floor. I told myself it was a dream, stress and lack of sleep creating hallucination. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen was real. The next day, I searched the local library for information about the house. The records were sparse, but I found mentions of disappearances, people who had visited the house and never left, all distant relatives, all staying alone in the house. The most recent was 20 years ago, a second cousin I'd never met. That night, I didn't just hear scratching, I heard whispers, a voice so faint I couldn't make out the words, but insistent, needy. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I barricaded my bedroom door and pushed a dresser against the wall where the paneling had been. It didn't help. The whispers continued, growing louder as the night wore on. By morning, I could understand them. "Feed me," they said. "Feed the hollow man." I packed a bag and drove to a motel 30 miles away, and checked in for a week. I needed time to think, to decide what to do. Selling the house wasn't an option, not if what I suspected was true. I couldn't subject someone else to whatever was in there. In the motel, I researched obsessively. I found similar stories scattered across centuries and continents, houses with impossible dimensions, hidden rooms that shouldn't exist, places where reality seemed to bend. One account from the 1800s described a house in England where the owner discovered a room that contained nothing but a chair, a table, and a ritual knife. The owner had sealed the room, only to find it open again the next day. People began to disappear from the surrounding village. When authorities finally investigated, they found the room filled with carvings, names, and tally marks. The house had been destroyed, burned to the ground, but the phenomenon had merely moved elsewhere, finding a new host structure. I realized then,
that the house itself wasn't the problem. It was whatever had taken up residence inside it, something old and patient, bending space to create a habitat. The Hollow Man. After a week, I returned to the house. I had no choice. All my possessions were there. My life's work. I told myself I'd pack what I needed and leave for good. But the house had other ideas. As soon as I stepped through the front door, I felt it. A shift in the air, a pressure change. The door swung shut, behind me, with a decisive click. When I tried to open it again, the knob wouldn't turn. "Welcome home," a voice whispered, so close it could have been inside my head. I ran to the kitchen, grabbing a knife from the block. Not that it would do much good against something that could bend reality, but it made me feel less helpless. That's when I noticed the change. The kitchen was longer than before, the ceiling higher. The windows showed a view that couldn't be real. A dense forest where there should have been a suburban street. The house was transforming, reshaping itself. I moved cautiously through the ground floor, noting the alteration. Doors that led to new rooms, hallways that twisted in impossible ways, staircases that doubled back on themselves. In the library, my maps were still spread across the desk. I compared them to what I was seeing now. The house had grown, expanded inward. It was larger on the inside than the outside, and still growing. Night fell suddenly, darkness sweeping through the house like a physical presence. The electricity flickered and died. I lit candles, creating islands of light in the encroaching shadow. The scratching started again, but now it came from everywhere. Walls, floors, ceilings, as if the entire house was alive, testing its new dimensions. I retreated to the library, barricading the door, but I knew it was futile. The house would open itself to me when it was ready. I spent the night reviewing my research, looking for any clue about how to stop what was happening. Most accounts ended with destruction, fire, demolition, one case of a house being swept away in a flood, but the presence always survived, finding a new structure to inhabit. One account, though, suggested a solution, a ritual, a bargain. Feed the Hollow Man, and he would grant you safe passage. The price was high. Blood, flesh, years of life, but it was better than the alternative. As dawn broke, the barricade moved by itself, furniture sliding across the floor. The door swung open, revealing a corridor that hadn't been there before. Narrow, wooden, carved with names and telemarks. I had no choice but to follow. The corridor led me deep into the house, through spaces that defied understanding, rooms that contained other rooms, staircases that led nowhere, windows that showed impossible landscapes. Finally, I reached a familiar space, the small room with the chair, table, knife, and candle. But now the far wall was open, revealing a vast cavernous space beyond, a space that pulsed with a sickly light, like a heart. In the center of that space stood a figure. It was tall, unnaturally so, its head nearly brushing the ceiling 15 feet above. Its body was thin, emaciated, skin stretched tight over a frame that seemed more hollow than solid. Its face was a blank mask, featureless except for a mouth, a wide, gaping maw that never closed. "The Hollow Man, you've come," it said, its voice resonating not in the air, but in my mind. "They always come." In the end, I clutched my knife, though I knew it was useless. "What are you?" "I am hunger," it replied. "I am the space between walls, the shadow in the corner of your eye. I am the thing that waits in empty places. What do you want?" "To be fed." Its mouth stretched wider, revealing not teeth but darkness, an abyss that seemed to go on forever. "Your grandmother understood. 5 offerings she made, 5 names carved by her hand. Your mother fled before she could learn the truth. But you are here now. You will feed me." I backed away, but the wall behind me had sealed itself. There was nowhere to go. "I won't," I said. "I won't kill for you." The Hollow Man laughed, a sound like wind rushing through dead leaves. "Kill? No, that is not what I require. I feed on time, on moments unlived, on choices unmade." It reached out a hand, long fingers stretching toward me. "Give me a year of your life, and I will grant you safe passage." 1 year, 1 telemark, a fair exchange. I hesitated. A year of my life. What did that mean? Would I age suddenly, my body advancing while my mind remained the same? Or would it be more subtle? A year of experiences, erased, memories never formed. Decide, the hollow man said. Feed me willingly, or I will take what I want, and I will not be gentle. I looked at the knife in my hand, then at the one on the table, the ritual knife, ancient and worn. I understood then what I had to do. I approached the table, set down my kitchen knife, and picked up the ritual blade. It was heavier than it looked, the handle warm to the touch. A wise choice, the hollow man said, its mouth widening in anticipation. I held the knife to my palm, ready to make the cut that would seal our bargain. But at the last moment, I hesitated. How many? I asked. How many before me? The hollow man's blank face seemed to shift, suggestion of features appearing and disappearing like shadows. Countless, it said. I have fed for centuries in houses across the world. Your family's line has been particularly nourishing, and if I refuse, then you join the others, the ones who said no, the ones who tried to fight. It gestured to the walls, the carvings. Their names remain, but nothing else. No body, no soul, just a mark in wood. I closed my eyes, thinking of my grandmother, of the 5 tally marks beneath her name. Had she made this same bargain? Had she stood in this impossible room, knife in hand, weighing her option? And my mother, had she somehow sensed the truth about the house, fleeing before she could be drawn in? I opened my eyes. Decision made. I agree to your terms. 1 year of my life, freely given. The hollow man's mouth stretched into what might have been a smile. Cut, then, seal our bargain. I pressed the knife to my palm, and drew it across the skin. Blood welled up, bright red against pale flesh. I held out my hand, letting the blood drip onto the floor. The hollow man surged forward, its body distorting as it moved. It caught the drops of blood in its mouth, that endless void, swallowing each one. I felt it immediately, a pulling sensation as if something essential was being drawn out of me. Not pain, exactly, but a profound emptiness. Cold spread through my body, starting from my hand and moving inward. A year of my life, flowing out with my blood. When it was done, the hollow man stepped back. It seemed larger now, more solid. The hollowness that had defined it was filling in, taking on substance. The bargain is sealed, it said. 1 year, 1 tally mark. You may leave for now. For now, the hunger always returns, and when it does, you will feel the call. You will come back to this house, to this room, and we will negotiate again. I clutched my wounded hand. And if I refuse to return, you won't, it said simply. The house knows you now. It will find you, wherever you are. Distance means nothing to spaces that fold in on themselves. It gestured, and a door appeared in the wall behind me, a door that opened onto my bedroom. Go, the hollow man said. Live what remains of your life, but remember I am always waiting, always hungry. I fled through the door, collapsing onto my bed. When I looked back, the door was gone, replaced by solid wall. No paneling, no hidden passage, just ordinary plaster and paint. But I knew the truth now. The hollow man was real, and it had marked me. I had bought my freedom, but at what cost? A year of my life, gone in an instant. I bandaged my hand, and packed a bag. I wouldn't stay in the house a moment longer than necessary. I would find a hotel, then an apartment. I would research more, try to find a permanent solution. As I was leaving, I noticed something in the mirror. A streak of gray in my hair that hadn't been there before, and lines around my eyes, deeper than I remembered. 1 year, made visible on my body. I've been staying in a motel for the past week, trying to make sense of what happened. I've searched for more information about the hollow man, about houses that are bigger on the inside than the outside. Most of what I've found is superstition and folklore, nothing concrete. But I did find one account that gives me hope. A woman in the 1920s, who claimed to have trapped such an entity by collapsing the space it inhabited. She had studied non-Euclidean geometry, finding ways to bend reality back on itself. She created a paradox, a room that contained itself, a loop with no exit. I don't understand all the mathematics involved, but I'm learning. I have time. The hollow man may have taken a year from me, but I'm still here, still fighting. Last night though, I felt it, a pulling sensation like a hook behind my navel. The house, calling me. I resisted, but it was difficult. The urge to return was almost overwhelming. And this morning, I found a new gray hair, Another line on my face. The bargain isn't holding. The hollow man is still feeding, drawing on my life force from a distance. If I don't find a solution soon, I fear it will consume me entirely. I'm writing this down as a warning. If you find yourself in a house where the dimensions don't quite add up, where empty spaces seem to breathe, get out. Don't explore. Don't try to understand. Just leave. Because once the hollow man knows you, it never lets go. The scratching has started again. I hear it even here. 30 miles from the house. Fingernails on wood. Testing. Probing. Looking for a way in. I think I've found a solution. A way to trap the hollow man permanently. The mathematics are complex, but the principle is simple. Create a space that is both infinite and contained. A paradox of dimensions. I'll need to return to the house one last time. Face the hollow man again. Offer it a bargain it can't refuse. If I succeed, the hollow man will be trapped forever in a loop of its own making. If I fail, well then my name will join the others on the wall. One more tally mark in an endless count. I leave this record in case I don't return. Look for me in the house on Blackwood Street. The one that seems to change size depending on where you stand. The one where shadows move when no one's watching. If you find a hidden passage, a hollow space behind wooden panels, do not enter. Seal it up. Burn the house if you must.
Don't feed the hollow man. 3 weeks later, the police report lists me as a missing person. Daniel Mercer, 34. Last seen checking out of the Pinewood Motel on Route 16. My car was found abandoned in the driveway of my grandmother's house. The front door was unlocked, but there was no sign of me inside. At least that's what they think. I'm still here, trapped in the spaces between walls, in rooms that shouldn't exist. I can see out sometimes, through cracks and keyholes, watching as detectives and relatives walk through the house, oblivious to the dimensions folding around them. My plan failed. The mathematics were sound. I'd created a paradox, a spatial loop that should have contained the hollow man forever. What I didn't realize was that I'd become part of the equation. To trap the hollow man, I had to trap myself as well. We exist now in a pocket dimension, a bubble of warped space inside the house, but separate from it. The hollow man and I locked in an eternal standoff. He's not happy. I've denied him his freedom, his ability to feed on others. Now there's only me, a finite resource that he must ration carefully. You've doomed us both, he told me after the trap was sprung, his featureless face shifting with rage. This prison will hold until your life force is spent, and then I will be free again. I don't know if that's true. The mathematics suggest otherwise. Once closed, this loop cannot be broken. But the hollow man is ancient, patient. Perhaps he knows something I don't. For now, we circle each other in this impossible space. I've carved my own name on the wall, but refused to add a tally mark. No more bargains, no more sacrifices. Time moves strangely here. Sometimes a minute stretches into what feels like days. Other times weeks seem to pass in seconds. I can't trust my perception anymore. The hollow man speaks to me sometimes in that voice that resonates inside my skull. He tells me stories of his origins, of the first houses he inhabited, of the people he's consumed over centuries. He claims he was human once, a mathematician who discovered equations that should not exist, formulas that bent reality. He created the first hollow space accidentally, stepping inside out of curiosity. By the time he realized his mistake, transformation had already begun. I don't know whether to believe him. Monsters always make themselves sympathetic in their own stories. What I do know is that he's weakening. Without new victims, without the regular tribute of life force, his form is becoming less substantial. The hollowness that defines him is growing, spreading. Sometimes I can see right through him, like looking through smoked glass. But I'm weakening too. Each day I feel more of my life draining away, not in sudden bursts like our original bargain, but in a slow, steady trickle. Gray has overtaken my hair entirely now. My skin sags, wrinkled and spotted. I move like an old man, joints stiff and aching. I've aged decades in weeks. The hollow man watches me decay with those features that aren't quite features, that face that isn't quite a face. He's waiting, patient, immortal. When you die, he told me yesterday, this prison breaks. Your life force is the key that locks it. When that's gone, I'll be free again. Then I'll never die, I said, though we both knew it was a lie. Everyone dies, even in a place where time and space have lost their meaning. Entropy prevails. I've been exploring our prison in my lucid moments, mapping its impossible geometry. It shifts constantly, rooms rearranging themselves, corridors stretching and contracting, but there are patterns, rhythms, like a heartbeat, and at the center, always, is that small room with the chair, table, knife and candle, the ritual space where bargains are made. I've been thinking about my grandmother, about those 5 tally marks beneath her name. What did she get in return for those 5 years of her life? What knowledge did the Hollow Man share with her? Yesterday, I found something carved into the underside of the ritual table. Not a name or a tally mark, but an equation, complex, elegant, written in a hand I recognized from birthday cards and Christmas letters. My grandmother's handwriting. The Hollow Man didn't notice me studying it. He was distracted, his attention focused on the boundaries of our prison, testing for weaknesses. I memorized the equation, working through the variables in my mind. It's a refinement of my original formula, a way to collapse the pocket dimension, not from the outside, but from within. A suicide switch. If I'm right, this equation will not only destroy this pocket dimension, but will fold the Hollow Man in on himself, compressing him into an infinitesimal point, a singularity of hunger with no way to feed. The cost is high. To trigger the collapse, I need to complete the ritual one last time. Not a bargain for a year of life, but for all of it, my remaining life force, freely given, a sacrifice. I don't know if I have the courage, but as I feel my body failing, as I watch the Hollow Man circle our prison with growing desperation, I realize I may not have a choice. Better to die on my terms, taking the Hollow Man with me, than to perish slowly and release him back into the world. Tonight, I'll make my move. While the Hollow Man is distracted, I'll approach the ritual table. I'll take up the knife. I'll complete the equation my grandmother began. If you're reading this, if somehow these words have crossed the boundary between dimensions, then know that the house on Blackwood Street must be destroyed, regardless of whether my plan succeeds or fails. Nothing good can come from its continued existence. Burn it, salt the earth, erase it from memory. And if you ever find yourself in a house where the measurements don't quite add up, where empty spaces seem to breathe, run, don't look back. The world is full of hollow men waiting in the spaces between walls, hungry, patient, eternal. Police report addendum, case in 2027, B filed by Detective Michael Harrow. The fire at 121 Blackwood Street has been classified as arson. The house was completely destroyed despite firefighters' best effort. The origin point appears to be a small room on the second floor, though the damage is too extensive for certainty. Of note, during excavation of the site, workers reported anomalous findings. According to the construction foreman, the foundation extended much deeper than blueprints indicated, with rooms and passages that weren't in any official records. Most disturbing were the carvings found on wooden beams throughout these hidden spaces, names and tally marks, hundreds of them dating back centuries. All recovered materials have been transferred to secure storage pending further investigation. The missing persons case for Daniel Mercer remains open, though with the destruction of the primary scene, leads are scarce. One item of interest was recovered, a small wooden box containing a journal and several pages of complex mathematical formulas. The journal appears to be written by Mercer, detailing his experiences in what he termed a pocket dimension within the house. The formulas are being analyzed by university mathematicians, though preliminary reports suggest they contain impossible variables and non-Euclidean constants. The site has been cordoned off and slated for redevelopment. Recommendations have been made to the City Council to create a public park rather than allowing new construction. Personal note, I've requested transfer from this case. The dreams started after I handled Mercer's journal, dreams of endless corridors and a tall thin figure with no face, just a mouth, always hungry. Email correspondence, Blackwood City Council, subject, Rising 121 Blackwood Development Plans, date October 12, 2026. After careful consideration, the Council has approved plans for new residential construction at the former 1421 Blackwood site. Environmental and structural surveys have found no issues with the location. The developer's proposal for a multi-family dwelling has been fast-tracked,
with groundbreaking scheduled for next month. Construction crews report unusual soil conditions. The ground seems to shift overnight, with excavations filling themselves in and foundation markers moving. The project manager attributes this to soil instability following the fire, and has adjusted plans accordingly. The first residents are expected to move in by next summer. Online forum post, Blackwood Community Watch, user new neighbor 22, date August 17, 2027. Has anyone else in the new Blackwood Terrace apartments noticed anything strange? I moved in last week, building C, 3rd floor, and the layout of my apartment seems to change when I'm not looking. Nothing dramatic, just small things. A door that was on the left side of a room is suddenly on the right. A hallway that seems longer one day and shorter the next. I mentioned it to the property manager, but she looked at me like I was crazy. Maybe it's just the stress of moving, but sometimes I swear I can hear scratching in the walls. Not mice or rats. Something deliberate, like fingernails on wood. And the dreams, I keep dreaming of a tall, thin man with no face standing at the foot of my bed, just watching, waiting. Anyone else experiencing this, or should I start looking for a good therapist? Reply from user oldtimer57, date August 17, 2027. Get out. That property has a history the developers won't tell you about. Look up the Mercer disappearance from a few years back. Before that, there were others. The house that stood there before was older than the town itself. They should have left it as a park like the police recommended. Some places aren't meant to be lived in. The scratching will get louder. Soon you'll notice the measurements don't add up. Rooms that are bigger inside than out. You'll find hollow spaces behind walls. Passages that shouldn't exist. And the dreams, that's him. The hollow, he's still there. Trapped but not destroyed. Waiting for someone to let him out. Leave before he learns your name. Before he carves it into the wall. Thread locked by administrator. Reason: spreading unverified rumors and causing community panic. Private message from oldtimer 57 to new neighbor 22. I know you're still there. I can sense it. The hollow man's prison is weakening. The new construction disturbed the equations, created gaps in the barrier. I tried to warn them. I burned the house, tried to destroy all trace of that pocket dimension, but some things can't be erased so easily. I'm coming back to Blackwood. There's another way to seal the breach, a more permanent solution. My grandmother showed me in dreams, after I completed her work. Don't trust the scratching, don't investigate hollow spaces, and whatever you do, don't make bargains. I'll find you when I arrive. Until then, stay in the lab. DM. The journal ends here. The remaining pages are blank, waiting for new entries, for new names, new tally marks. The hollow man is patient. The hollow man is hungry. The hollow man is waiting for you.